As everyone is aware, we are recording these sessions. It's our goal after the conference finishes up on Monday. We're going to break up each of the different sessions, hopefully into a series of lesson plans for schools to be able to use in the classroom. The quality of the speakers and the content that we've had, I think, far exceeds what most students have access to in the classroom, and probably what more teachers really have access to themselves. And so we want to make sure that this gets out to them and they can use this to help educate students. We've got a fantastic lineup today. We are going to hear from some wonderful speakers, and we have a series of wonderful sponsors that want to make sure and thank as we go through the week. The conference is being sponsored by several different foundations, several different organizations, and a couple of individuals. And we are very pleased that we have one of our sponsors with us today, someone who is familiar to many of you through her work in the nonprofit sector, her work at the state legislature, and now her work for PAYCOM, one of the most charitable companies that we have operating in the state of Oklahoma. And we're very fortunate that they support many of the initiatives that OICA works on, and she is also one of our board members. So it's my pleasure to welcome the Honorable AJ Griffin.
Thanks, Joe. Good morning. Good, happy snowy morning, everybody. I see a lot of familiar names and well, not as many faces, but a lot of familiar names. So just welcome this morning. Dr. Gaddy, it's good to see you. Craig, good to see you. Everybody, thanks for investing your time in this. And as an OICA board member, I want to start there just to say thank you for the work that you do with kids across the state and the support that you provide to the causes that we champion. Anything that benefits the children of the state of Oklahoma is going to be on the OICA agenda. As a former legislator, I want to say thank you for engaging in the process and knowing that every good advocate's goal in life is not to have their elected official's phone number, it's for them to have yours, so that you're in the driver's seat. And then representing PAYCOM, just want to say that we have the opportunity to partner with a lot of Oklahoma nonprofits and to support them in ways financially, to provide them a great product that helps them manage their HR. We have, as clients, a lot of fantastic nonprofits, including OICA, that we do not only support through our philanthropic efforts, but we also do business with them. And proud to be an active member of the sector, the nonprofit sector, all across the country. Little known fact about our company, we have over 3,000 nonprofit clients. And so we're experts in helping nonprofits streamline their HR functions and really do like partnering with them. And we do have a giving program that not only gives here in Oklahoma, but all across the country. And that's been an awful lot of fun to get started. So have a great day, learn a lot, listen to the experts, and most importantly, take what you learn back to influence this process.
Thank you, AJ. Thank you very much also to the Richardson family, to PAYCOM. I said OICA is not only a beneficiary of their support, but also allowing you to have those work hours to be a part of OICA's board and be the chair of our advocacy committee. We are going through the bills right now. We had a meeting yesterday. We have a meeting today. We are trying to decipher the language on some of these. There are a lot of great bills filed, and then there are some others. And so we will be active in keeping you aware of those, and certainly want to take this opportunity to invite you to our bi-weekly child advocacy chats. Every other week, we're going to have a conversation about what's happening at the Capitol, hear from an organization or an individual involved in some type of policy that's going through the Capitol. Our first one will be on February 21st, so 2 weeks from Monday. And we'll be hearing from Hunger Free Oklahoma talking about the DUO program and SNAP initiatives in the state and the work that several organizations are doing through the Childhood Food Insecurity Coalition, trying to raise awareness, and then our own local coalition that's working to raise awareness about the DUO program. And so certainly want to invite you to that. Go to oica.org and you can sign up to receive the information. It's all in our weekly newsletter that we send out on Thursdays. If you do not receive that, it's not too late to sign up to receive today's. Mr. Gunn is going to be working on that throughout the conversations today, and we hope you get a lot out of that. For those of you that are members of OICA that pay the $120 per year or at some different level, we also send a Tuesday newsletter that's geared more towards scholarly research and papers that are published. And so if you're not receiving that, please let me know and we can get you signed up for that as well. We are a few minutes ahead of schedule, but I know our speaker will certainly keep you entertained and probably will need more time for questions than what we allotted. So Dr. Gaddy, if you're ready to go, I want to go ahead and let you get started a little bit early if that's possible.
No, it's my pleasure, Joe. It's good to be here this morning. How is everybody?
So far, everyone seems to be doing okay. And I ordered my team to stay home today. A couple of them wanted to go into the office and just feel like today's a good day to be inside.
Yeah, it's wise. Snow's picking up again here in Norman. I popped over to the gym real quick and it's underneath that snow, it's still a sheet of ice. So I think keeping everybody home is definitely wise today. So, well, first of all, I appreciate everybody being here, and it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to come and work with OICA. OICA, along with Regional Food Bank, are, to me, in my mind, the two most important and valued not-for-profits in the state. Okay, and I happen to have close ties to the leadership of both, and appreciate the work that they do. And also, it's good to see that my favorite former public servant is here. So Senator Griffin, it's really good to see you. And I'm sorry I missed you up in Stillwater, but we decided to get out of town real fast after that game. So
yeah, I bet you did.
Yeah, we did. I tell you what, that traffic headed south on I-35, we were running along with traffic. It was 100 miles an hour. They could not get away fast enough. It was the longest, most sustained sooner rush we had seen that day. Anyhow, all righty. Well, I'll tell you what, Joe had asked me to come in and visit with you all a little bit about sort of, with regard to Oklahoma, where do we come from and who are we? And how do we get where we are now? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to engage in a combination of talking with you all a bit about some history, give you a little bit of context and add some storytelling. I do have some data I'm going to pull up, but I'm going to go kind of light on the data today. And how I'm going to ease into this, so I'm going to talk with you sort of about, I'm going to start with indicating how I ended up here, moving here from New Orleans 26 years ago, which was that I had a desire to be at a public university. I'd been teaching at Tulane, which is private. And I wanted to get back to teaching politics. I wanted to be in a state that wasn't too big, at a university that was public, that also had a tradition of really good college athletics. And so I ended up here at University of Oklahoma and have been here for 26 years. I had not planned on staying that long. I thought I was going to come in here and do some things and then probably move back east. And lo and behold, I had an opportunity to move back to Georgia a few years after we got here, and we ended up staying. Because when you get here coming from the outside, you discover that you are quietly in one of the most interesting, unusual places on the planet, in Oklahoma. Sitting here on the plain in the middle of the continent, 4 million people, 2 mid-sized cities, a relatively new set of communities and culture. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating place. And you look at the scope of its reach and its impact, whether you look at the First Nations that were moved here over the course of a century and their resurgence and their revitalization, or you look at the cultural impacts in country music, literature, for example, theater, film, authorship, writers, okay. Autobiography of an Invisible Man is one of the great works of African-American literature, history of the United States, written by a Tolson. Impacts in business, the energy sector, so many things, so many places where this place reaches out and touches and shapes the world and creates a perception of this place that's outsized. We are outsized in the culture. It's only that Texas is so big and so loud next to us, we don't have more of an impact, to be honest. But anything that is done in Texas, we probably did first and did a little bit better, to be honest. We did it first and we did it a little bit better. And then somebody in Houston bought it and moved it. The reason I bring this up, this is in a way the story of Oklahoma, which is its unexpected discovery from unexpected directions by unexpected people. And then also unexpected tragedy and unexpected failure. It's a hard place to live. The climate is wild. The weather is demanding, unrelenting. We make our money initially by taking resources out of the ground, whether it's agriculture or resource extraction. And we have to be creative about it. And it puts us at the will of the weather, at the will of international markets, which many of our local public don't understand and don't care to understand. And that is the ancient story of the farmer and the more recent story of the oil and gas man, right? And this is the foundation of the shape of our previous economy. All this goes to say, we're very new. We're very new. We are maybe on our 7th generation of people who have come in the territory days, statehood. Maybe on our 10th or 11th generation of most of the First Nations were moved here in the middle of the 19th century. So we're just getting used to the place. And when we compare that to the experience of Europe or Asia, where you have anywhere from 1,000 to 4,000 years of cultural continuity, linguistic continuity, we're very new. We're very, very new. Yet the things that happen in Oklahoma go out and affect and shape the world. Yet in the midst of this, in the midst of having all this outsized impact in creating billionaires and in creating innovation, we look around and we see a place that frustrates us, makes us sad, okay? We see poverty around us. We see economic collapse from time to time. We see cycles that impact stability. We see things that are very hard on human beings, things that really test our resilience. And we ask why we can't do better. And then we look around and we get frustrated. And what we have to do is we have to take a step back and think about what we're really trying to do here and who we are. If you look at Oklahoma right now, probably about 65% of the state's population are Anglo whites. Okay, 2/3. The remaining 1/3 is a mix of a growing Hispanic population, a moderately growing Native American population, a somewhat growing African American population, and a small growing Asian American population. About 9% of the state claims to be multi-ethnic, multi-race, or multiple identifier, okay? So we've got a population that is incredibly diverse. It basically looks like the United States. And then when we look at, the demographic of interest to the organization sponsoring this event, we discover that we are incredibly diverse. And Joe, I'm gonna share a slide here real quick. Okay. For whatever reason, I'm not sharing. Oh, there we go. Bear with me just a moment, everybody. Being on faculty, I've never used Zoom before.
Got it. That looks good.
Okay. So, okay, here we go. There we go. Okay, so this graphic, I made this graphic about a year ago to do a briefing for the OU regions, okay? And I wanted to demonstrate how things have changed in terms of our potential student body from in-state. And so this graph shows the changing demographic profiles of people who are 17 from 1960 to 2029. So I'm projecting out 10 years from the 2019 ACS, these data from 7-year-olds. And what we see is that the population that's under 18 right now in Oklahoma is about 54% Anglo-white. But what's interesting is the population in Oklahoma that's over 70 is about 83% Anglo-white. That the population that is over 50 is roughly 75% Anglo-white, okay? So let's think about where the decision makers are, where the wealth is in this state. Let's think about the people that go in the room and make public policy, right? And let's think about how they grew up and what their culture is, and what their experiences are. And then let's think about the profile and the culture and the experiences of the children who are being impacted by policymaking. These are very, very different publics, okay? Very different communities, very different experiences. And we need to make note of that, because oftentimes when we talk to many policymakers in this state, especially older policymakers, older publics, older leaders, they start with the basic assumption that their experience is a normal experience. Their experience is an ideal experience. And their experience is the experience that everybody else should conform to. Okay. Now I'm saying this as a 56-year-old Anglo-white Protestant. Okay. So I speak from my group. This belief that this is what the world ought to be, and that their memory of high school or of the university or of family, it's what's available to everybody else, or what it ought to look like. And by gosh, if we just did it right, if these people would just do what they're supposed to do, everything would be fine, right? If they would just be normal, as one lawyer friend of mine puts it. Okay, here we go. Well, that's kind of hard. These data are a couple of years ago old. They're from the American Community Survey. And these are data on youth in households and parents by household and the prevalence of economic poverty. And I would ask you to look at, if you look at the columns, there are 3 categories of interest here. We have children who are in a household with a married couple, a household with a male head, no wife, or a household with a female head, no spouse, okay? And if you look, you can see the stark differences that arise, either as a consequence of single parenthood or divorce. And you can see it in the context of income, but you can also see it in income below poverty, children growing up in poverty, children living in rental versus owning their own household. And these data will also replicate themselves in areas such as food distress, okay? And what you see is that there is a stark different life out there for a child who grows up in a female-headed household, female-only headed household, versus a 2-parent household. Now, the old model would be, well, they just shouldn't have gotten divorced, so they ought to get married, right? So now we're back to Governor Keating's covenant marriage policies in the 1990s. Or we need marriage incentives that somehow will fix this. Life isn't that simple, and we know that, because the correlates of love and the correlates of marriage are not governed by economics alone, right? They're governed by other things that matter. But we make policy in this space where we often have policymakers who perceive that the column-headed married couple is the space where we make policy for. It's how we shape institutions. And that experience is fundamentally a white and Protestant experience. Now, in this state, 70 years ago, 60 years ago, 50 years ago, that would be the case. It's not the case anymore. It's not the case anymore. We are dealing with durable intergenerational poverty in some areas. We are dealing with a growing demographic, a set of growing demographics that are most likely to live in poverty, less likely to have economic access. And they are the coming majority in the state. And they have often different religious backgrounds, different cultural experiences, and a different relationship to the institutions of order than we see in our vision of history. Okay. Now, the reason I bring this up is that this kind of leads into the hope of Oklahoma. if we go back and we look at this statement, look at its origins. And when I say its origins, I'm going to start with, in the 1830s, we displaced a large number of Eastern First Nations from Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee. And they are either voluntarily asked to remove after a transaction moving their land out of their possession, things like the Cherokee Purchase or the Jackson Purchase, or are otherwise compelled to leave by force by the US government on a devastating journey, which costs thousands of lives, tens of thousands of lives. We're not sure. And they get to Oklahoma and they settle in. And part of the rationale for moving the First Nations to Oklahoma came from Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, who had previously been both an Indian fighter, but also an Indian agent. He had worked on the purchase of the land from the Choctaw in Tennessee and Mississippi. And he had advocated for the removal of the tribes beyond the Mississippi and beyond Arkansas, because he felt that the logical settlement line for Anglo-white culture in North America would pretty much end at Arkansas. It wouldn't get much beyond the Mississippi River, and it wouldn't come below the Missouri. So if you could move the First Nations that far out west, there was no way that Anglo culture and the Anglo economy would make it out this far. And Jackson was wrong, incredibly wrong in this respect, right? And the First Nations get here. They settle in, they build institutions, they transmit their sophisticated government and institutions. They bring their industry, they bring their farming practices, they bring slavery, right? They settle in here. And there was conflict between the Eastern and the Western tribes, because tribes that are already here are being displaced and are culturally very different from the First Nations of the East. Incredible diversity in the First Nations. And Civil War comes and goes. And part of the healing of America after the Civil War is the opening up of the West for future settlement. In 1862, you have the passage of the Morrill Act, which will give free land to anybody who will homestead that land for a period of time. And we infill the continent from coast to coast, completely around Oklahoma. And then there's still demand for land, and the demand for land comes into these territories. And this is where we get to the idea of Oklahoma being improbable. Edward Everett Dale. I assume some of you guys went to University of Oklahoma, right? That'd be a fair guess. Okay. You remember Dale Hall and Dale Hall Tower over there at Elm Street and Lindsay, right? Those are both named for Edward Everett Dale, the only person on campus to have not one but two buildings named for him. And Dr. Dale was a historian, a former dean of the university. And he observed of Oklahoma that it was cobbled together like a quilt from the tattered remnants of what was left over from the creation of all the rest of the states. That we took bits and pieces that were left over from getting Texas, getting the Louisiana Purchase, and after we had put everything else together, we made Oklahoma. We made Oklahoma out of Oklahoma Territory. We made it out of Cimarron. We made it out of the Cherokee Strip. We made it out of the First Nations in the East. And we put it together, and it is quietly incredibly diverse. And this goes to the one piece of Oklahoma that's never been transmitted to the world. There's a perception in the world that Oklahoma is essentially, how did I put it one? It's a Klansman riding a flaming tornado across a denuded plain being chased by a dust storm. That is a popular global perception of Oklahoma. Even though Oklahoma is hilly in some areas, if not mountainous, it's verdant, right? It's green. It has a diversity of flora and fauna. It has Red Rock Mountains in the southwest. It has a small desert, right? It has beautiful, beautiful high plateaus, right? You go out to the Panhandle. It is an incredibly, amazingly diverse piece. It is the place where all of North America comes together in all of its diversity. The only thing we don't have is a good solid ocean front, okay? But incredibly diverse place. And so similarly too, we find now are the people. The people of Oklahoma are cobbled together from bits and pieces that come from everywhere else in North America and also the world. The initial settlement of the state after the Native American, First Nations arrival is coming in part from expatriate Southerners after Reconstruction, moving to the Jim Crow era, moving here from failed farms to try to engage in new farming or seeing speculative opportunity, or they come with the railroads when the railroads come in, or they had come with the cattle when the cattle came through and decided to stay, or they came from Eastern Europe, or they came from Ireland, because the opportunity to have your own land existed here. And they bring a variety of linguistic and cultural traditions in here and wonderful place names that we put our own spin on. So if you've not been to Prague, go to Prague, right? And you'll see how Czechoslovakia helped shape Oklahoma a tiny bit. Go up to Korn, which was a German city originally. And you'll see a variety of different small inputs here. And the product when we get to statehood is a creation of a relatively socialist state. 15% of voters in the state vote socialist for the president, for governor. There are several socialists elected in the state legislature. And these are actual socialists, not the way we characterize Democrats now if you're in the Republican Party. These are actual real socialists. And it looks like this state may actually end up with a relatively liberal, if not progressive, political tradition emerging. But there's a push coming from another direction, which is this is also the only state to ever come into the Union from territory status segregated, with legal segregation, okay? And we also voted in prohibition, right? So this was a state that was strongly influenced by the Second Great Awakening in American religion in the late 19th century. This wave of primitive Protestantism that sought to return to the original church and to place a basis on fundamentals of religious worship and biblical literalism, right? Strong investment in these places. We have Carrie Nation coming down from Kansas, busting up bars, for example. Yet in the midst of this, we also had the African-American population, which sought to come in, but to a certain extent kind of got stopped at the border. There was a movement of African-American settlers that come into Kansas called the Exodusters, okay? And the hope of the Exodusters was that they would find a place in the West where they could move beyond Jim Crow. And unfortunately, Jim Crow chases America across the continent. A lot of people don't realize this. They think that Jim Crow and segregation was a Southern thing. It's only in the former Confederacy. It doesn't happen anywhere else. Jim Crow was vibrant in Oklahoma, powerful in Oklahoma. Some of the early lawsuits of the mid-20th century that led to the integration of schools took place in Oklahoma. And at that time, we had political leadership that stood up and said, yes, we will take the lead on this. We will comply with the courts. We know this is the right thing to do. A person is a person. But nonetheless, this also led pushback. Why was there pushback? Because Oklahoma, as much as it had all this other diversity, had this religious foundation, it also had a strong foundation in the creation of the modern Ku Klux Klan. It's estimated that there were more members of the second Ku Klux Klan, which emerged in 1915, in Indiana and Oklahoma than anywhere else in the United States, okay? Indiana and Oklahoma. And this Klan had a strong investment and infusion into community leadership in a variety of communities. And during World War I, the Klan took preeminence in running a thing called the America First Committee in the state of Oklahoma, whose job it was to push back against anti-American elements in the state of Oklahoma and ensure that we were a patriotic state that got behind the war effort. And this is the first of a series of sort of anti-red, Americanist, nativist movements in the state of Oklahoma. It starts really with the America First movement in Oklahoma in 1915, from 1915 to 1918. It returns again later in the 1930s with the Red Scare that attempts to take after efforts by communists to organize labor in Oklahoma City and in Tulsa, and in particular, the burning and looting of a communist bookstore in Oklahoma City and the arrest of the owners, which led to which more recently was dealt with in a book published by University of Oklahoma Press called Books on Trial. which featured one of a series of colorful district attorneys that we've had in Oklahoma County. And this also created the foundation of appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court protecting unpopular speech. Okay, so yet again, we find ourselves at the front lines of shaping things far beyond our borders. In the 1950s, we see a strong anti-communist movement in the state again. We see a strong emergence of the John Birch Society in the state in the 1950s and 1960s. And this walks hand in glove with efforts to move towards nominal integration of the state. And a tremendous step forward in terms of economic development in the state. The Dust Bowl laid the state flat on its back, and it was one of the only states in the country to actually actively lose population between 1920 and 1950. We bottom out in 1950 as a non-growth state. And by the time we get to the 60s and the 70s, and we see the energy boom taking hold, it appears that a lot of this type of rhetoric and this type of politics are being left to the past, okay? And we see two things that happen at the same time. One is the emergence of a viable and competitive Republican Party created by Henry Bellman, a progressive Republican from southwestern Oklahoma. And also, we see the emergence of a relatively progressive wing in the Democratic Party. And we see that come to fruition in 1991 when David Walters was governor and the state made its most massive investment in public education up to that point in time. So we thought we were emerging into a new space, right? And this goes back to where Oklahoma shakes the world again, right? One of the things you need to know about Oklahoma, and we're going to go to a very different place for a minute, is we have an unusual banking industry, to say the least, okay? And for some reason, just being an ordinary professor and a dean down here at OU, I know a lot of bankers. I don't know why. I know a lot of bankers, and they all tell me the same thing, which is Oklahoma is interesting in that no great national bank has been able to come in and dominate the banking industry, and that we have a variety of local and regional banks that, even though they are consolidating, are sufficiently strong to weather it on their own, right? And the reason for this is the experience of the 1980s with Penn Square. I won't go to the details of what happened with Penn Square, but needless to say that a lot of very creative things with financing and loans tied to the energy sector led to the bankruptcy of a relatively small bank that had been overladen with debt relative to its deposits, the Penn Square Bank. And this rippled through the financial services industry. The United States ended up changing regulation of banks in the US. Tips into the S&L crisis of the 1980s and demonstrates one of the real problems of Oklahoma historically, which is that because we're into resource extraction, because we engage in attempting to find ways to get profit quickly, right? There's a lot of risk taking that takes place. It's what's called the wildcatter mentality in the energy sector, okay? And since we will be using this in the schools, I will not quote the wildcatter's prayer to people here, but if you've heard it, you know it, I'll send it to you later, but it's not fit for public consumption. But it basically goes along the lines of, dear Lord, if you give me one more boom, I promise to not mess it up again, okay? And for this state, this wildcatter mindset, it all came to a head. It came to a head in the 1980s. And it broke the back of the state, and it broke the spirit of the state more so than anything that had happened previously, because it was completely in the hands of people to have done this thing, right? It was completely in our hands, and to a certain extent, we made it happen. We got over leveraged, we took on too much risk, and we wrecked the place. And then we spent 20 years building our way out of it to emerge where we are now, which is with a diversified and vibrant economy, right? It has fits and starts, but the problem is it's not an economy for all of Oklahoma, okay? It's an economy for some of Oklahoma. And I'm gonna show it to you in brief here, okay? This is a population density map by county for the state of Oklahoma. The largest, most populated county is Oklahoma County, followed by Tulsa County. And then you can see every other county of consequential population touches these two counties, except for Comanche County, where Lawton is. So our three major urban centers, that's most of Oklahoma, that's 60% of the population of the state, okay? Those three urban centers. The other problem we have is that those urban centers, these urban centers are behaving differently. Tulsa and Oklahoma City are growing, Lawton is not. The dark blue shaded counties are the counties where 90% of the growth of the population of the state of Oklahoma is. The red shaded counties are counties that have actively lost population. It's not just they're not growing or they're not growing as fast, they're actually depopulating, they're emptying out, okay? The population that remains is getting older, all right? Young people are not staying, opportunity is going elsewhere. And what we're seeing is an emptying out of southwestern Oklahoma, an emptying out of the Panhandle, an emptying out of that whole area west of the Osage Nation, and an emptying out of Little Dixie. Okay, if you're not near a good lake, or near a 4-lane road that goes to Texas, or near Oklahoma City, or near Tulsa, you're in an area that is not growing, and it makes economic opportunity very, very difficult. Okay. These are also the areas where, when the energy sector comes online and offline, the greatest disruptions occur, because this is where the drilling is happening, okay, especially in the western part of the state. And rig count goes up, populations go up, rig count goes down, population count goes down. And this is a big part of our challenge, is figuring out what language we're going to speak in to talk about the future of the state, where we deal with a population that looks very, very different from ourselves or our parents or our grandparents' vision of Oklahoma, and what that means in terms of cultural change, economic change, political change, but also how we manage rural decline and how we manage providing services and providing a quality of life in terms of the support that's expected from a state to these communities, while also encouraging the growth that comes in the areas that are booming. And we balance these things. And I'm going to just step back from giving an academic lecture and say, this is my fear for Oklahoma. And what I've seen in the last few years is a lack of regard for your fellow man is costing us. A lack of regard for other people in our behaviors, in our charity, in our actions is costing us. And it's bringing out the coarseness that's always existed underneath the surface of Oklahoma's politics and Oklahoma's communities. And I'm not sure how we put it back. I'm not sure how we put it back. So not a happy note there, Joe. Sorry about that. But it's not a happy time, right? It's not a happy time. So as much as we talk of the Oklahoma Standard, we discover whenever something bad happens in crisis, we need a durable Oklahoma Standard. And my hope is what everybody here is committed to making. All right, thank you. I'll take questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Gaddy. And certainly want to open it up for questions. I know there have been some great comments over there. And on your comment about oceanfront property, I give the Red River about 1 million years, and we'll see how that works out.
Well, it's yeah, exactly. 15 years ago, I threatened to run for governor as a joke. And my campaign theme was to change the state name from Oklahoma to Excelhoma, because instead of being okay, we should be excellent. And I wanted to actually dig out a channel up the Red River all the way to Texhoma and then build mountains in the western part of the state, because that's the only thing that separates us from the tourism of Colorado is we don't have good mountains, right? But yeah, I appreciate it. The Red River will get us there. And also, Claudia, I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, so I'm very familiar with the Hoosier experience, and I appreciated your comment. All right, who's got a question? Or did I make you all sad?
You've had nothing but wonderful comments over here in the section. I appreciate it. Picture for people.
Well, Joe, it's actually, let me give you one last thought to think about. I'm on the faculty of the architecture college now, and I'm actually teaching design studio over there, which another time we'll sit down and I'll explain how the heck that happened. But OU has a tradition called the American School of Architecture, which was founded by Bruce Goff. And it shook the world of design in the second half of the 20th century. It really did. And it's what's called an organic architecture. And Frank Lloyd Wright inspired this movement originally at the end of the 19th century. Organic architecture argues that we make from what we have to make buildings and spaces that relate to the area, that relate to nature, that we relate to the built environment. So when we build a house that looks like a Cape Cod in Oklahoma, we're going to have problems because we're going to put tar paper shingle on it, which is going to attract heat, which we don't want to do, right? We need to build for our environment, is what organic architecture would argue. It's one of the things we teach in design at OU. Government's the same way, okay? When you build government and you build policy, you could wish you could build for something else, but you have to build with the material that you have. And the material we have is we have Oklahomans and we have Oklahoma culture. Okay, so we're going to have to build public policy, build solutions, cognizant of the fact that we build that from the people we have, rather than sitting around and complaining that this isn't Berkeley. And I don't want this to be Berkeley, okay? Let's build with what we've got, right? And that's the upside of this. The thing is, getting people to understand that what we have is a lot more diverse than what they think it is. That's the challenge, is opening people's eyes, hearts, and minds to that notion that it can be done differently. Rebecca, you're exactly right. Yes, material has to fit environment. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
One of the things I've always found fascinating is the difference between Eastern Oklahoma and Western Oklahoma. And I know that comes from times of settlement. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, Eastern Oklahoma, we're talking about first and foremost the shaping by the First Nations. But even beyond that, if Bob Darcy were here in the room, and that'd be great if Bob were here from up at Oklahoma State. If Bob Darcy were here, he would say it has to do with the difference in the basic culture. That Eastern Oklahoma has what's called a traditionalistic culture, okay? That we do politics by tradition, that we do economic exchange by tradition. It's a handshake culture in that respect. But also, if you had power, you'll still have power. That there are families who have power, there are sources of power, and by tradition, that's where the power resides. Eastern Oklahoma is historically much more individualistic, okay? It grows out of a settlement pattern that comes largely out of, that's coming out of the American Midwest and the Upper Plains, okay? Or it's coming actually from Europe itself. And it's much more geared towards individualism, individual liberties, individual responsibility. If you look at it in terms of physical environment, you see a difference in the nature of how communities are laid out. You see a difference in the architecture. For that matter, you even see a difference in the means and nature by which people might maintain their property, okay? They are culturally very, very different. You've got the resource extraction tradition in Eastern Oklahoma is more mining than oil, for example. We have to remember that. There's a reason sulfur is called what it is. And also because it started with the First Nations, because it had a Jim Crow legacy that goes back further in time, okay, further in time. It has a different political culture. It's more historically, traditionally Southern. The bottom has fallen out on that. The nature of the Protestant religious traditions are different. The east of the state is far more Baptist. When you go to the west, what you find is you find, for example, more Church of Christ, right? So you find more charismatic traditions as you move west in Oklahoma. More Pentecostal tradition also, which means you have a different view on the relationship between faith and politics, okay? So there are a lot of things that are just very different, very different. The one thing they have in common is they're in decline. There are two Oklahomas. One Oklahoma consists of two 50-mile wide two 50-mile wide ponds of population in Tulsa and Oklahoma counties. And then there's the rest of it, if we simplify it. And it's a hard challenge for us because representative power is going to keep moving to the cities.
Well, for years, we were one of 3 states that the urban areas were more conservative, or more Republican. I won't say more conservative, more Republican than the rural areas. And that's certainly changed in the last 2 decades. What's your take on that?
Oh, tremendous flip. And that's just part of the 1990s realignment after it's funny, the Ronald Reagan is the disruption, but he doesn't realign Oklahoma. The 1994 election and the evangelical resurgence that accompanies the growth of the GOP, the Contract with America campaign, that's really what changes Oklahoma, because it brings an entire generation of young politically ambitious people who are now mainly in their 40s and 50s into politics almost entirely as Republicans. There are a few of you like yourself, Joe, who were not in the Republican Party, but by and large, the young people who got activated to politics in the 80s, who moved into actively in the 1990s, came in out of that socialization, movement conservatism. And now, one consequence of this is that we've always had these tensions and this diversity in the state GOP, right? But it really is evangelicism, evangelical mobilization really changed Oklahoma more quickly than anything. My colleague, Alan Hertzke, who's now retired, wrote about this extensively for a dozen years. But what we're seeing is we have leadership in the legislature now that comes directly from that. The pro tem, Greg Treat, my student, my friend. Greg was, I guess he was born in 1976, I think, 1977. He literally grows up in this. He is a preteen during Reagan. He's a teenager when the Contract with America hits. He's in college, goes to work for Tom Coburn, does other things in the GOP, then gets to the state Senate himself and becomes pro tem. And he comes out of this long tradition of public service among this particular generation of Republicans. There's a sizable number of members of the GOP who were in the legislature for about a dozen years, who created the majority, who grew up in the socialization, who are dedicated to the core principles of Ronald Reagan's Republican Party. And I think a lot of them are at odds with the modern GOP, because it is a consequence of a next wave that comes that is more nativist and populist, and really emerges after the 2010 election, and really comes in after some of our anti-immigrant legislation of about a dozen years ago. So this is where the tension is in the GOP, in my opinion. But I've stepped back from actively monitoring the state's politics, so I can't really speak to that with as much authority as others in the room, maybe.
You lucky devil.
It was a conscious choice, Joe. I gave it the office, man. I did this stuff for 20 years and 14 years consulting on litigation, polling this state. It was fun. But at some point, you feel like Sisyphus rolling a boulder up the hill, and you're afraid the boulder is going to roll over you. Okay. And so it was time to go build beautiful things. That meant working with people on, so my studio last semester, my advanced studio, they did a environmentally friendly redesign of the Oklahoma County Jail. And you can find this online. You can tour the model. It's time for somebody else to do politics, right? But the history is still there. It just manifests in different ways. So
I blame my dad for my hard-headedness and my political registration. So yeah, I agree with you
that. Joe, it's this is the one thing that is good with Oklahoma. If you can get any two Oklahomans to sit down and agree there's a problem, they'll work on a solution and they'll come up with one, right? The challenge is agreeing that there's a problem. And there's a tension that will exist in this state so long as religion is foundational in our politics, which is asking the question, what aspect of faith informs our actions in the public sphere, right? And if we just say, without putting labels on people, there's a tension between people who view Christianity as being about fundamentalism and doctrine, versus people who view Christianity as being about social justice, versus people who view Christianity as being about prosperity, and the manifestation of the complete self-actualization of the individual in this world, right? Then there is the need to remind folks that there are other religions out there, and they are here, right? And if you look carefully at some legislation that's been posed in the state, such as allowing a parent to object to content that a student finds to be religiously objectionable, I'm waiting for a Buddhist in a classroom to stand up, right? Or a Jew, or a Hindu, right? Or a Catholic. Because that legislation is modeled with a very particular religious worldview in mind. And it goes to the other great challenge of Oklahoma, which is who will own the moral nation, the moral space, okay? This state was founded on the idea that second great awakening morality would govern the state, right? That we would have a Protestant prayer in the schools. We would have no liquor, right? We would do these things, right? We would have a Protestant moral space, right? And that's going to be challenged now. It's going to be challenged. State's very different. Hey, I see the chat is blowing up, and
yeah, I've got three primary questions I want you to hit on. First, there was one talking about the laws that have been filed and policy changes on schools. I know for years the state legislature, the two dominant issues with them were roads and schools, and probably in that order in the rural legislators. If they could build a road, they were going to be good in their districts. What have you seen as far as some of these changes of what we're seeing with better funding for roads and then changes in school policy as far as transfers?
Joe, I'm going to disappoint you here. I'm not keeping up. It's, I've always been an advocate for open transfer and for competitive school system. The one piece of the school system I'm concerned about is I think that a perfectly good opportunity with charter and with online has been destroyed by the actions of Epic, which is the single most corrupt action in the state since the county commissioner scandal. So, hey, I got to take another call in about 2 minutes. So let's get to the next question, if you don't mind. I'm sorry. I had to sleep until 9:45, right?
We had you, actually, we're getting really close to the time. I had you at 9:55, but that is
okay.
completely fine. The next one was the growing infrastructure in the rural areas allowing for greater telecommunications. How will that possibly impact the movement to rural areas?
Well, it depends on what else is there in the rural areas, right? The movement away from the major coastal cities to places like this, being able to telecommute is a big part of that, but there has to be a quality of life. I had the privilege of going out to Cordell, Oklahoma, to photograph the courthouse there, and I had some of the best pizza I ever had in my life. The local pizza place has broken the sauce and the crust recipe on Hideaway, okay? And the possibility of growing something there could exist, but there has to be a quality school there. There has to be a quality of life there that people want. And quality of life is more than affordable housing. So telecom's the beginning, but that's no guarantee it'll bring anything else in. I mean, I think we should be chasing every pipeline and every windmill with a wireless router. Okay, I mean, I firmly believe that we should have a bubble over the whole state. We need it. I mean, we need it for ag, right? We need it for wireless ag technology. This has to happen. Okay, what's next?
The changes of what you referenced with the lessening of the evangelical movement as far as the population. It's definitely a smaller but louder crowd now. And how do you see that playing out?
I don't know. They've never been more powerful. They've never been more powerful. I don't know. I worry that there's no good, clean end to anything we're dealing with right now, in part because of forces that are beyond the control of institutional actors. So I'm a very worried man.
The last one would be changes in voting as far as allowing for open primaries or ranked choice. Do you think that's a possibility?
No, not with this legislature, no. It's funny, we had a shot at this when Glenn Coffey was pro tem and we blew it. Glenn was all about this stuff when he first got to the state Senate, but I think cities might be able to get away with it. But any reform that seems to broaden the franchise or capture more information seems to run into a lot of trouble in Republican states these days. So I wouldn't see it happening in our lifetime, which is a shame. But I hope I'm wrong, because I think ranked choice is one of the best ways to vote. So, all righty, guys. I'm afraid I've got to go. But Joe,
Thank you.
thank you very much. It's a pleasure. I look forward to doing this again. And everybody, Joe knows how to find me. Please reach out. I look forward to hearing from you. Take care.
See you soon, sir. All right, we are going to have about a 5-minute break. Want y'all to chat amongst yourselves. If y'all have any questions, certainly throw them into the chat, or you can throw them out to me, and we can certainly get those to Dr. Gaddy, or we'll see if we can answer those. I hope. I'm sorry we had to rush through those questions. I hope we got to those, or at least the surface of your questions of what we asked. Those were some great policy questions, and as Keith and I have talked about, he has pretty much separated himself from a lot of the political landscape. He chose that partly because of his mental health. He wanted to get away from all of the day-to-day political activities, and he's been enjoying writing books and working towards more inside the university there at OU. But he's still so well connected and well-rounded, and as you can tell, an expert in this area when it comes to Southern political history, and particularly Oklahoma's political history, even not growing up here. It's just amazing the knowledge that this man has. I would put him right up there with Bob Blackburn on the knowledge of our state and what we see. So want to allow y'all a couple of chances to visit and take a quick break. And then next we'll be hearing from Haley Falconberry and Alex Adkins, our lobbying team with the OICA, talking about some of the differences between lobbyists and how to be an effective lobbyist at Capitol. So go ahead and talk amongst yourselves. I've got to let my dog back inside. He's scratching at the back door. The joys of working from home. If we want to go ahead and get started a few minutes early, Haley and Alex, if y'all are on, we can go ahead and get y'all queued up.
I am here, and I will text Haley and have her hop on a little early.
We're going to spend lots of quality time with you both over the last couple of days. We've been going through the legislation that's been filed, and Haley and Alex did a great job of preparing a tracking list for us and going through and putting together our naughty and nice list for the legislative session.
Never a dull moment. It's almost like sessions coming up when we get to see a lot of each other.
Well, Alex, why don't you go ahead and tell a little bit about your background. I've known you for a very long time, and glad to see you in this role now, but you've had a pretty good career, an amazing career so far, and just what you've been working on. Why don't you share with everybody a little bit about your credentials?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, my name is Alex Adkins. I grew up around the Capitol. My dad was a legislator and then a lobbyist, and my uncle is a lobbyist, and was also a legislator. So I had no choice but to enter that building. I am an attorney by trade. I went to Oklahoma State for undergrad and then to OU for law school. And directly after law school, I went to the Attorney General's office. And so at the Oklahoma Attorney General's office, I was an assistant attorney general as well as a legislative liaison. So I have been a legislative liaison. I know what it's like to advocate on behalf of the state for a state entity. And then I was there for about 2 years. Loved it, but recently entered the private sector. And so now I'm with Haley at A&A Advocates. And so I have seen it from both a legislative liaison side and from the lobbyist side. So entering my first session as a lobbyist. And there are differences. There are also some similarities, but it's advocacy either way. And so it's been a really interesting experience, and I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Well, just with everything you've been following through the last few years, there have been some good things that have happened last couple of years, especially in health and mental health, and a lot of the work that we've done with the OICA. just the take on what we're seeing, it looks like there will be about 5,000 live rounds at the beginning of session. That seems overwhelming, and some people feel a little ridiculous that there's so much out there. Can you talk a little bit about just some of the variety of what we're seeing?
Yeah, and Haley, I think you're hop on, so feel free to jump in and interrupt me at any time. There are a lot of bills out there. So in Oklahoma, the legislative sessions run in 2 years, and so we are in the about to enter the second session of the 58th Oklahoma legislature. So all bills from last session that did not either get directly clearly killed or signed into law are now reinvigorated and alive where they left off in the last session. And so, as you probably remember, COVID's a thing. And so the last session, we followed what we call the COVID year, where very few bills got passed. The Capitol shut down a little bit, and we were passing things that had to get done constitutionally or just required to finish for the session. And so a lot of bills, especially last session, we had way more bills than usual. And there's always a lot of bills, but that was a lot even for a typical session. And then this year was a little bit high, but smaller than last year. And so there are a lot of bills out there ranging every topic you can imagine. We've got elephants, firearms, medical marijuana, everything you could want to see. And so that's sort of where we're at this year. One thing I think is important to note is that this is an election year. And so all members of the House of Representatives are up for election at the end of this year, and then half of the Senate as well. And so election years are always a little bit interesting because it can be a hard time for controversial topics, or maybe a good time for a controversial topic that you want to take a spin on in your election. So it will be an interesting session for sure, but it always is.
That's the truth. Every session is different. Everyone has its own personality.
Absolutely.
None of them are boring.
Yes.
Haley, are you on with us now?
Hey, everybody. Yes, I'm here. Thank you for inviting us again this year. It's so good to see everybody. Even if we are all freezing, I'm glad Alex and I went both with a turtleneck today.
Yep.
But of course we would coordinate. But no, good to see everybody, and good to see you, Joe.
You as well. Alex introduced herself. Dr. Gaddy had to hop off early for a phone call, so we started your presentation a little bit early. I wanted you to introduce yourself and give a little bit of your background, and then we'll start talking about the role of lobbyist.
Yeah, absolutely. And I won't worry you guys too much. Obviously, I've spoken to this crew a few times because we have been OICA's lobbying firm for quite some time now. But my name is Haley Falconberry. A lot of you guys know I am excited to be wrapping up my divorce and back to that maiden name. So yes, this is me. It's Haley Blood, but back to the maiden name of Falconberry. But no, a lot of you guys know my background. Started in state government, actually worked for the Department of Human Services for several years before being recruited by Sterling Zerley and his crew over at the Public Employees Association, where I served, kind of moved my way up from membership to membership director to deputy director of that organization. And at that time, Dennis Adkins, who is the founder of our lobbying firm, A&A Advocates, was the contract lobbyist for OPEA. And he kind of stole me from Sterling, and Sterling was gracious and of course was excited for me. And I came over to A&A Advocates, where I specialize on particularly a lot of the agency relations type work at A&A Advocates. So very deep into policy areas. And as Joe knows, and as a lot of you guys know, I've been very blessed to work on a lot of reforms that deal with children's issues. So child welfare heavy, social services, criminal justice reform, Medicaid, all of those fun things that impact those kiddos across the state. So that's kind of my background.
We appreciate both of you taking time to be on here today. I know it's a very busy time as you're trying to go through and read bills and decipher what many of the bills are saying. Through the years, I've had the pleasure of working with all different kinds of lobbyists, and I think there's probably some misconception about what lobbyists are, what they do with a lot of people out there. And just wanted to see if y'all could do a discussion, talk a little bit about the different types of lobbyists and how advocates can be more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to kind of kick off. I know Alex is probably best to talk about a couple of these, so I'll just kind of kick off, but maybe we can tag team this, Alex.
Love it.
I think the group that everybody thinks about when they hear about lobbyists is they think about legislative lobbyists. So I think that's kind of foremost in everybody's mind, and that is no doubt a large chunk of what a lot of us do, but we kind of wear various hats at the Capitol. So legislative lobbyists obviously specialize in lobbying the legislature. Obviously, we're at the Capitol every single day, and various companies hire lobbyists to specialize in what they do, to understand what they do. But then the biggest role we play is to also understand the legislature, understand what they're going through as far as being elected officials and the priorities of the state, and where whatever the companies that we represent, whatever they need, how that fits into the larger picture. So I always kind of say it's our job to understand kind of the chessboard and the various plays that are going on, because unfortunately, with everything that goes on at the Capitol, we kind of say, a lot of you guys have heard me say this a lot of times, you can't take politics out of politics. And you might have the best policy idea in the world, but it will get mixed into the politics of what's going on every session. Alex already mentioned it's an election year, so it's going to be a hyper political year. And so a lot of what we do is just understand, how do you make your message resonate with the legislature? Where does it fit into the overall big picture of what's going on in the state, and communicating with the clients that we represent? So that's kind of the legislative side of lobbying. I'll go ahead and tackle executive lobbying. That's another side. That's kind of where my specialty actually is. And that is the interaction between the executive branch and the executive agencies and the legislature. A lot of times is what we specialize, or the admin rules, which again, I'm going to start phasing into Alex, because I'm going to let her kind of handle some of that, because it's so important for the other piece of kind of the lobbyists that are out there, the legislative liaisons, because they're very involved in that as well. But so much of what we deal with in state government isn't done on with a statute. So obviously with the state constitution, then we have Oklahoma statute, then you have agency rules and regulations and administrative rules. And so much of what we deal with children's issues, it's impacted by the things the agencies do. So whether it's, the discussions of Medicaid service delivery reform, whether it's child welfare, things going on in child welfare with the Pinnacle Plan, or it's, the reformation of things going on at OJA as they're, moving to their new facility and offering more therapeutic solutions for our kids in the JJ system. A lot of that is also very agency heavy. So with executive lobbying, we're talking a lot to the directors of the agencies, the governor's office, OMES, and really working through that. Admin rules and legislative liaisons, I'm going to pass to Alex, but again, it kind of bleeds into what the executive lobbyists do, and Alex is a pro at admin rules. So I'll let her kind of handle that, and then let her talk about what legislative liaisons do.
Yes, admin rules are so much fun. They tie both to executive lobbying and also to being a legislative liaison. And so Haley mentioned the kind of the hierarchy: constitution, statutes, admin rules. But admin rules, when passed in full, carry the weight of law. And so you'll see a lot of times in statute, it will say the attorney general shall promulgate rules, or OJA shall promulgate rules. And that means you guys figure out the details. And so that is a lot what executive lobbying can be doing, is you're trying to impact that system and say, you're going to make these rules. It would be really great if it had this piece in it, or how can we help you draft them to make them better for the work that we do in the state? And so that applies to executive lobbying, but also to a legislative liaison. So all of these state agencies have their own legislative liaison, and that is essentially a lobbyist for the state. We still register for the Ethics Commission. We still file out our ethics reports. However, it is just a different brand of lobbying. So when I was a legislative liaison, I wasn't taking people to dinner. I was still going to the Capitol and I was communicating, but you're representing a state agency as opposed to a company. And so, and I would say that your obligations and your priorities as a legislative liaison depend on what agency you're working for. So I was employed by the Attorney General's office as both an assistant attorney general and as legislative liaison. So my priorities were attorney general priorities. So unique things like constitutionality of bills and things like that. I did a lot of work on the opioid commission, which is how I got a lot of my agency rulemaking experience. And so when you are working for that agency, you're speaking on the agency, because as we all know, these directors and appointed positions and elected officials that run these agencies are a little bit busy. And so that's where a legislative liaison comes in, is they are an employee of that agency. So they know the ins and outs, they know what's important, they know how to issue spot, but they also understand that political landscape that Haley talked about and how to make your agency's priorities intertwine and work with the political landscape of Oklahoma in an election year, not in an election year, just following the priorities of the legislature while pushing the priorities of your agency.
And we had a conversation yesterday with Ashley Kemp with the Ethics Commission. All lobbyists that are paid in some form or fashion have to register with the Ethics Commission, isn't that right?
Yes, everyone registers with the Ethics Commission, and you will do reporting monthly, except for in the interim, you have a big report that you do. You register every year for every client that you represent. And so lobbying is very monitored in Oklahoma. We have a very secure lobbying process here, and our Ethics Commission is very strong and very helpful to lobbyists as well. They're really great at answering questions and making sure that we're all working towards a common goal of good policy in Oklahoma.
We have a lot of citizen lobbyists who are advocates. Could you both talk a little bit about the difference between being a paid professional lobbyist and being a citizen advocate? Both of you are at the Capitol, but really there are differences in what you have to do as far as the law and differences with the job.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to kind of start that. The difference is, again, we're paid to do this. Various companies employ us. We are constantly in contact with the legislature, but the biggest difference is that paid piece. So once you're paid by a company to be up there representing their behalf, that's when you have to register. You guys are subject matter experts, you're constituents. It's not that, you guys are probably more important in a lot of ways. And truth be told, you probably understand the issues more than us. It's that we are typically, people get nervous about lobbyists is I guess the best way to explain us. And we are out there spending money on behalf of our clients sometimes through dinners, through things like that. And so it is a little different as far as some of the tools we have in our tool chest to be able to work with the legislators. We do a lot of campaign donations, which I know you guys do too. And that does have to be public, by the way. You don't have to file it, but the legislator does. But the really big difference is we're just paid to be up there, and it's actually our 24/7 job. But what I would say is I think it's actually more impactful for you guys to be up there and to be active. Again, not to say it's not important what we do, not to say that a legislator, when we walk in the room, they don't go, oh, this is important. This is something that's passionate to them. But at the end of the day, again, we're kind of paid to do it. When you guys walk in, you're passionate about those issues. And I know some of you guys on the line actually are registered lobbyists for your individual companies. So you kind of know what I'm talking about. But for those of you guys that just really have a passion for this work and you're coming in as a subject matter expert and you're a constituent to the legislators that you're talking to, I cannot overstate how important that is to the legislature. And so much of what OICA accomplishes is not because of the work that Joe does or the work that Peyton does. It's the work that you guys do as the advocates of Oklahoma, the folks that are really there in the weeds. And I just have to thank every one of you guys, because every time we get a bill passed, every time we kill a bill, it's not because of the work going on at A&A Advocates. It's because of the work and the passion of every one of you guys that reaches out to your legislators and truly lets them know how this is going to impact. And there are so many people on this line that I've met with and learned from. And we just couldn't do the work that we do, quite honestly, without you guys.
Now, why should somebody pay and register as a lobbyist compared to being a citizen advocate?
Like, I can tell you the law and at what point you have to.
That would be good.
Yeah, no. So I get this question a lot. It's come from our clients. Like, at what point am I kind of reaching over and becoming a full-time lobbyist? The pay, number one. but also just the amount of time in your work. So if you're working for a company and they're sending you to the Capitol, and within your job description, let's say you're an executive director or you're a policy director, and most of the work that you do is 3/4 of something else other than going to the Capitol, you're perfectly fine. For lobbyists, the difference is that it's what we're paid to do, and it's our job description is the best way to explain it. And I think that's actually how the lobbying rules, the ethics rules work in the state of Oklahoma and how they read, is it comes down to your job description. So if you're being paid and your job description is to influence legislators or an agency, you might look at that and talk to your boss about making sure you're registered as a lobbyist.
Now, one of the things we see, there are hundreds of people listed on the lobbyist list, and very few of them actually go to the Capitol. Who are all of these people?
I wonder that too, because I don't see you guys up there every day. No, I'm joking. No, it's people that just, they don't do it every single day. So it's still their job to be the voice for their company and to interact with the legislature. And it's not physically being up there. I mean, there are days like today, it's snowing. I could still probably lobby all my day. I just got to shoot a text message. So number one, I think some of them, it's just folks that are communicating in, you know, the new technologically savvy era. And I think it's some folks just trying to be safe. You know, nobody wants to get the ethics commission up in their business. Ashley probably appreciates the fact that I have a healthy fear of her. And so I think companies just want to be honest. You know, we're Oklahomans. We're not trying to hide stuff. We're like brutally honest, good folks in the state of Oklahoma. So I think that's what that probably is. I think what sets us aside, and where Alex and myself, Dennis, who runs our firm, other lobbyists that you guys might employ, we're just there every single day. So we're what are called contract lobbyists. And we're the folks that just every single day we're up there. And it's because we work with multiple folks. There's not a day that a bill passes that myself, Dennis, and Alex aren't going to care about it or have something on our agenda. It's that we do represent different folks than just OICA. So we're different in the fact that we're contract lobbyists because we represent multiple companies. Now you might say, well, that's a little weird. How do we know they're kind of working for us? Don't worry, everything's public. Joe knows exactly who we're working for and we can't have conflicts. So that's kind of the difference, I would say, is we're just up there a little bit more because we have a lot of clients that we represent.
Yeah, and that's something you just said there, touched on a topic that comes up often. For contract lobbyists, how do you handle a conflict when you have a client that may be butting heads with another client?
So it's so funny because it is different. And Alex, I'm gonna let you kind of speak to this because Alex, I'm sure she told you guys, she is actually a hotshot attorney. So I always tell her it's her job to keep me out of jail because I'm not a hotshot attorney like her.
It's a full-time job, don't worry.
Dennis is the tricky one.
Yeah, he's the tricky one.
But no, we have, it's different than some professions. So for those of you guys that are attorneys, you know that you have rules with the Bar Association, and Alex can kind of speak to that. With us, it's that it has to be public, who we represent, and it's just an agreement between your clients. And so I will tell you, you guys have a very good executive director running OICA. He makes sure that we do not have any conflicts. But it does come down to what the individuals that we represent feel and, you know, looking at our client list. And Alex, you can probably speak to a little more formally how that's different than other professions, that it is done just on a kind of an agreement between us and the client.
I can speak to it like from the law perspective. And so for those of you that are attorneys, it is a different obligation than we have ethically under the law. And so in the law, a conflict is a little bit harder to get past. And so in lobbying, it is totally up to the clients. And if they think the conflict can be overcome or avoided or minimized and how to work around that. In the law, it's a little bit more stringent on you really can't have conflicts. And in lobbying, it is up to the client to decide if the conflict is something that they can work with. And so that is what's different. And I think a lot of other agencies that are regulated by something like the Bar Association or other sort of governing agencies like that tend to dictate ethics rules and PR rules on how to handle that. But in lobbying, lobbying is really all about the client. And so that's what it comes down to in our conflicts as well. And everything is public. You can go and look up any lobbyist in the state at any time and see who they're representing. And so that is what the Ethics Commission does, is keep everybody open and accountable, and to foster these conversations of, oh, I see you're representing them and representing us. How can we talk about that?
It's funny because we kind of get a bad rap as lobbyists, I feel like, but our side of it is so transparent. So I have a lot of friends in the election space or like initiative petition space. And I'll ask them, like, what are you up to this week? And they're like, oh, yeah, I can't tell you. I'm like, what do you mean you can't tell me? Like, what client are you working for? Like, it just amazes me. And I'm like, how do people call us dirty lobbyists when you people don't have to say who you're working for, who's paying you? Like, I give them a hard time because they're always like, oh, Haley, the fancy, dirty lobbyist. I'm like, no, you election people. Y'all are the sketchy ones. So, and I hope some of them are on the call. I haven't looked at the participant list, but y'all know who you are if I'm talking to you.
Well, we have the election board secretary coming up at 10:55. He may do a count.
Yeah.
It's way less transparent. Everybody knows everything I do. Y'all know everybody I work for. You know, every dollar I spend. Like, we are the transparent crew.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump in there to add something. So for legislative liaisons, when I was a legislative liaison, you've also, if you're working for the state, you have open records and open meetings you have to comply with. And so if you're working for the state, the legislature is exempted from that. But any state agency, so this factors into being a legislative liaison or working as an executive lobbyist, you also have open records requests you have to be cognizant of, and knowing that if you are basically, if you were emailing, calling, texting a state agency, it is public. And so just the big lesson they teach us in law school, and I think we should teach everyone, just be careful what you put in writing. And so that is another, I think, factor to consider, especially for the state agencies, is that it could not be more public if we tried. So.
Yep. No, Dennis taught me, I'll never forget, and he can't take credit for this either. I have to throw credit over to Jim Freed, if any of you guys remember Jim and ODN. They always said, it's a really funny joke until it's slid over to you in an FBI transcript. And that's kind of how we have to think, because as much as we talk to these folks, obviously we have very good friendships and very good relationships with agencies and the executive branch, but you do have to kind of think sometimes like, man, if I'm ever sitting in a chair and an FBI transcript comes across my way, is that joke funny then? Probably not. So
never send an email you wouldn't want read in a deposition.
Yes.
Ask John Gruden about that. Everything is public and nothing ever goes away. You have to be careful because all of that is open and transparent.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to us about and I know your job is in seasons. Talk to us about a typical day right now, a typical day during session, and then a typical day in the interim following session.
Yeah, Alex, do you want me to tackle it first, or do you want to go?
Yeah, you jump in and I'll cover what you leave out.
Okay, awesome. Well, let's start with session. There is no typical day during session, is what I would say. In Oklahoma, we do not get a lot of a heads up about bills that are coming up in especially like committees or even the floor sometimes. At most, we typically get like a 72-hour notice, and that's awesome. I love a 72-hour notice. Most of the time, we're dealing with 24-hour notices. And so literally, we just try to get everything on our checklist for the day done before the next day starts, because we don't know what our next day is going to look like. So I always liken it to being a plate spinner. And I can't remember who told me that one. I can't take it as my own thought, but somebody said that once, and I think it's the best analogy, that literally you're trying to keep different plates from falling, and you just run to the biggest, it's kind of like the fire scenario. You run to the biggest fire. And so you're kind of plate spinners, and you don't know day to day what your day is going to be like, but you do know you're going to be at the Capitol or a state agency, and you're going to be dealing with something that's going on in the legislative world, more than likely. From there, I would say the interim is a little more, calm. I always urge our clients to get things done when it comes to policy discussions in the interim, because during session, politics takes over. Your policy arguments should be won in the interim, because you're going to have more time with the legislators. You have the ability to be back in the districts, talking to them as a constituent, and it's just a calmer environment, quite honestly. So that would be my kind of difference is, you know, you can kind of actually build out a schedule during the interim. You can catch the legislator and have a little more time. The session is an extremely busy, extremely hectic time to talk to legislators, quite honestly. And I don't think a lot of folks realize that. I would also say, and I think Joe can probably speak to this very well, AJ Griffin, who's on the line, can, as former legislators. I was trained by Dennis Adkins, the owner of our firm, who's also a former legislator. Alex, the same. She's learned from Den. She's learned from her father, who was a legislator. They are inundated during legislative session with so much information. And we all know that it's very hard. You know, you have to hear things, especially large concepts like what we deal with, like the child welfare system, the juvenile justice system, you know, food security, housing, all of these policies that they're having to learn. Imagine having to learn that on top of tax policy, oil and gas policy, utility policy, aggregates, every single agency, what the budget is going to look like at every single agency, vaccines, medical marijuana, like all of these things that they get thrown at them during session. Reading hundreds of pages of bills every single day, it's just not conducive to doing a deep dive on policy issues. So that's the other, you know, thing. I always tell everybody, it's almost like the interim is practice and session is the ball game. And my dad was a coach. So, you know, you practice in your off season, session is season. So we are primed, we are ready, we are in shape, and we're about to start playing the ball game. If you don't put in all that prep work, you can imagine how that game's going to go. You just run out of air. You can't handle it. You don't have the stamina built. So that'd be kind of my few analogies for it. Alex, did I miss anything? Joe, did I even answer all of your questions?
No, I totally
I know
agree.
there's a lot of homework that's going on right now too. Definitely want y'all to brag about yourselves with everything y'all are doing on that.
Oh, Alex, man, I have to brag on her. That girl reads bills every day. And she's the attorney, so she gets to figure out if they're even constitutional.
Which is, that is a full-time job. Yeah, bills are a lot. There are a lot of bills out there. You've got to know what's out there. That is, I think, the most important thing to know as a lobbyist or as an advocate at all is you got to know what's out there. And so, and there are all kinds of tools we get to use. The Oklahoma legislature website is awesome. And so I would advise everyone that's an advocate to play around on there. Bill search is great. You can search by author, by topic, by title. And then we have also other programs that we use to search for bills as well. But I mean, I'm a little old school. I think there is no substitute for sitting down and looking at everything that was filed. And so bill deadlines starting in December. And so now we're starting to see everything that's out there and just trying to know everything that is out there, I think is the most important thing. I totally agree with Haley that policy is really best handled in the interim. And there are a lot of great discussions happening in the interim through interim studies where legislators get to really take a deep dive into an issue and bring in speakers to help craft legislation. By this point, policy kind of needs to be handled so that the politics can play, because this is where stuff gets passed, this is where stuff gets worked on, but true policy discussions, conversations, and drafting need to happen earlier in the process so that just because, as Haley mentioned, the legislators are so busy and it is just triage constantly. And then I saw a question, has looked at
Alex, you had a question.
Yes, that it actually has become pretty cumbersome to read every bill. I 100% agree with that. It is, I mean, you can ask Haley, the last few weeks after the most recent bill deadline, my life has been reading bills, and it is very time consuming. And so that is sort of where I emphasize that is what people pay us for, is to read all of those bills, because it is very cumbersome. In an election year, you have a lot of bills looking at a lot of different topics. You sort of see the hot ones, vaccines this year, obviously, things like that are timely, but I would absolutely say that it is cumbersome to read all the bills, but it's worth it because for me, preparation is key. So.
Oh, one of the things too, you just touched on the time drain on your personal lives. A lot of people think that lobbying is fun and games. You get to go wine and dine legislators, and if you're good at the gift of gab, that's really all you need. Could you all talk a little bit about that? Because I've tried to discourage people from going into lobbying just because there's so much that is not known behind the scenes of what people need to know about lobbying.
Yeah, so our team is kind of interesting because I would say we all kind of have different skill sets, and every single one of them is what makes us a good team at ANA Advocates. And it's a lot of skills. Not to brag, but Alex is very details oriented. And so, she's really good at digging in and really understanding some of those policies and looking at it from a legal perspective. I'm probably at what, I think when you look at the lobbying world, you would term kind of the policy nerd. So I really also enjoy the policy of things. And I'm always looking at it from does that make policy sense? So Alex is looking at a bill, she thinks legally, does that make sense? I look at a bill, I think policy and implementation wise, does that make sense to me? And then Dennis is our political guru. Obviously, he's the former legislator. So when Dennis looks at a bill, he thinks about politically, does that make sense in the state of Oklahoma? Is a legislator going to be willing to vote for it in an election year? He's probably the most outgoing of us. I'm a little more reserved. Alex is probably kind of in between, really, really talkative, but can also kind of be a nerdy policy nerd like me. And so it takes a large skill set. And I think that some of the most successful people at the Capitol also realize that. And they work, with groups. And a lot of times you can be the most impactful on an issue by putting a coalition together. Because, not only is it about having constituents, having subject matter experts, but little secret in life that I wish I'd have known at the age of 15 or something, not everybody in life is going to like you. And in the state of Oklahoma, everything is so relational. So we literally look at the legislative list and we say, okay, this person is somebody that Haley's close to. This person is somebody Alex is close to. This person is somebody Dennis is close to. And we even split up issues like that. So, being able to really reflect on all of those various things is what kind of helps you guys put together good policy teams and good lobbying teams.
Veronica asked a good question up here, and I know Ann is going to talk a little bit about that as far as researching bills and understanding bills. And we have a new guide that we put on our website just a couple of days ago about the intricacies of legislation, understanding the different sections. But could you all talk a little bit about her question, what guidance you might have for easier understanding of reading bills, what to look for?
Alex, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so when I first saw that question, my first thought was, if you work in a specific space, my favorite place to start if I'm looking for something specific is to go to that title of law. And so 10A, if you're looking for kids, 21, if you're looking for criminal justice, things like that. And so you can pull bills by title of law. And so I started from House Bill 1001, and I worked my way down. But after that, I think a way to really dig in deeper is I will do searches by title. And so that's how I like to do it. And I think that might just be my legal mindset. But a lot of you advocates that work in specific areas, you probably have 2, 3, 4 titles of law that you tend to focus your work around. And so that's, I think, a good place to start, especially if you don't want to look at all the legislation. I like to kind of drill down and focus on the titles that you're looking for.
No, that's Alex just hit the nail on the head. If you guys care about, certain issues, just run the title search. So you can also go to OSCN and see all of the Oklahoma titles of law. I think you go to legal research or something to do it. It'll say Oklahoma statutes. There you go. And that'll outline for you. So obviously everything's very organized in statute. And when we say title, that's just the title of the Oklahoma statute. So when Alex says 10A, that's the title for the children's code. She said, was it 20, the legal
21
one?
and 22 are the 2 criminal justice ones.
Yep. I think Title 63 is taxation. So if you pull the bills by the title they're under, that's going to let you kind of, see. And I can't remember on the state side. We have a system at ANA Advocates that we also purchase that helps us with bill tracking. Mm-hmm. We have the ability to look at it by subject, by keyword, all of these things. So our system at ANA, we actually have a very organized system. I do the first look at everything that gets filed, and I look at it and I say, is that a top priority for a client? If it's a top priority, I flip it. Alex then goes through and she looks at every single bill and she organizes them, and she looks further into the title and keywords and things like that she'll see. Then we run different searches just by the titles of law to make sure we didn't miss anything. Then we pull a list of every single bill that was filed. We look at if we're tracking it, and if we're not, we think, okay, that's a little weird, because we track just about everything and we make sure we didn't miss stuff. So just know, as like folks that work with OICA, we do a deep dive. And, when you talk about the difference between lobbyists and, just, people that advocate, that's probably one of our biggest differences too, is we get fired if we miss something. So we really thoroughly look at that.
And then Terry, I saw your question, domestic violence. There's not a domestic violence title in Oklahoma, but I would look at 21 and 22 to start. It's going to be under the criminal codes. But yeah, LegisOK is great. I've used eCapital as well. Those services are great, but as an advocate, they're expensive. And so I think we are really blessed with our OSCN is, a gold standard in the nation for statute and case law. And then the Oklahoma Legislature website is also very user-friendly, and you can search by title. I don't know if you can do subject, you can do title, author, things like that. So I would just recommend playing around with that. And looking.
You can create a tracking list on the state site.
Yep.
I'll be honest, it's so good. I've used it before. So I'm weird. Like, we get so busy. Sometimes I will literally go take our top 5 priority bills for our firm, and I'll stick them in that, because I know if I see an email come across for that, oh my gosh, that's an even quicker way I can look at it, because it differentiates. And so it's amazing. I think AJ just added something about it too.
You can search by subject. AJ verified. You can search by subject.
Awesome. Thanks, AJ. Joe, you're muted.
It happens every time. I'm going to do a share screen. I want to show people our document on our website that they can look at. And I want y'all to provide commentary, kind of like Mystery Science Theater 3000. So can everybody see that? Alex, you can see that? So this is the cover of our Understanding Legislative Language. I will say this is our first draft, but I wanted to get it out there prior to the conference for people to look at, and put the link in the section. And here's the table of contents, just basically things that we felt like you need to know as far as understanding a bill. And we stole this from the Oklahoma Intercollegiate Legislature. All of us are familiar with that.
I was in that.
If you weren't, you missed out in college.
It was fun.
It was such a great primer for understanding the legislative process. But OIL uses this guide to teach college students how to write the bills for their mock legislature. And so we wanted to adapt this for use for OICA for advocates to understand. And it just provides the initial steps for where do we find a good idea? How do I develop my idea? Where's my topic fit in the state law, and how to write my idea for legislation? Now, remember, you're not going to write this yourself. There are professionals at the Capitol that write the bills, and lawmakers that tell you when they write their bills. That's not always the case. Most lawmakers come up with an idea, write the initial idea, and then give it to the legislative staff to find a way to fit it into the legislative process and into the statutes. That way,
sometimes they ask us to do it too.
That is true.
I will say, the legislative liaison, you do typically, I feel like, write more than you would writing bills for the agency.
But for an advocate, if you have an idea for a bill, this is a great worksheet to start your ideas. And this will help if you have a lobbyist or you have a lawmaker you're working with. This will be a good sheet to provide to them to explain what you're wanting to do with fixing a law. And then you can go down and it talks about the different sections. I'm going to blow that up. I'd have to switch over to another screen. But here is the cover of a piece of legislation. We start out state of Oklahoma, first session of the 58th legislature. That was last year. This is the second session of the 58th legislature. Here's your bill number. Here is the author. And this one was Sherry Conley working on a piece of legislation that deals with adverse childhood experiences. Here's the version of the bill where it says it's introduced, and then here is the title of the bill, and you've got the numbers over here that show, because oftentimes you'll refer to a line number, and here's the enacting clause, be it enacted by the people of the state of Oklahoma, and then your first section describes if it's a new law, an amendatory, or a repealer, and then it tells you here where it's going to fit in the statutes. And so this guide will go down and show the different components and explain what they are. So if you have trouble understanding how a bill is written or have never delved into this, I feel like this is a great primer for individuals to learn that process and to help your lobbyists out.
Well, the hardest thing in Oklahoma, what I would say, is that when bills start changing, because the way we post it on the state site doesn't show the changed version. We have to use our purchase system. The other thing that's tough in Oklahoma is the way we do our repealer laws. It'll just say repealer and the title of basically the statute. It lists the statute that's being repealed.
And then you have
And
to go
so
forward.
that gets a little tougher. Then you have to go to the OSCN. Even we have to then go to the OSCN website, and it can become a mess.
And
Joe, somebody's asking if this is a public document that they can share with others. I'm assuming it is, correct? It's on our public site.
Yes, absolutely. I put the link in the chat section for this specific document PDF. I will say there are a couple of things I want to change. Ann Roberts offered some great input on this last night. I want to make a couple of minor changes, but the bulk of this, I would say 99.9% is going to stay the same. So nothing that's going to change is a flaw. It's just fine tuning it a little bit. But here's one thing: when funds are available, always look for that in a bill, because lawmakers pass wonderful ideas, but then if they don't appropriate the dollars, then that is on the books, but it just never goes into effect. And so that's just something you always have to watch out for.
May versus shall. That's the first thing I teach everybody. If it's a may, means the agency or somebody can choose whether or not they do it. Shall means that is the law of the state of Oklahoma, and they have to abide by the law. So there's little tricks like that too to learn.
That's true. And I probably need to add that into this verbiage to watch for. Note, we've got to hear the board shall consist of 5 members, and they shall be paid annually for their services. So those are the things you have to look for. And then Mark Harder, who is the head legal counsel of the House, had me add this part in, just showing the old diagram tree for how they operate on the staff as far as plugging in things in legislation. And you as lobbyists, I mean, y'all have to watch this language constantly. How much of your time is monitoring amendments as I'm scrolling through this?
A lot. Especially once we get into the session and things start changing in committee and on the floor. That's a big part of it, is a bill can change form entirely from the time it is filed to the time it is passed.
And this is one thing you should watch for: the emergency clause. I talked about that yesterday. Here's the verbiage for the emergency clause. The difference between short title and a title. Short titles are used basically as a lobbying effort by the lawmakers themselves to give something a really cute title that's hard to vote against. AJ, anytime you have anything you want to add on, please jump in.
You guys are doing great.
And so there used to be a provision for severability clauses about the separation of those if they were ever challenged in the court, but that was fixed legislatively several years ago, where they don't have to have a severability clause now in each bill. And here is the list of the titles of the statute, so you can get an idea for your issues. We deal a lot with 10A and Title 10. And you can just run through these different titles and see where each of these may have an impact on the work that you do. But most of your advocacy efforts, your lobbying efforts, are going to fall into those with your area of interest.
And so there's all the titles right there. So then you don't have to go to OSCN to grab those. So that's helpful.
And then down here, we put the, scroll down a little too far, the different types of legislation. We covered that yesterday. But here Here's an example of, and these are not real lawmakers, these are not real bills, but you can kind of get an idea of just looking at a bill. And we tried to pick bills that are only one page to make it easier. And if you're printing these off, it won't waste your paper. So that's a new law. And then here is an amendatory changing the Oklahoma statutes with the strikeouts and the underlines. And then here is the repealer. I need to put a note on here. That was one of Ann's suggestions. But this is all you get when you're dealing with a repealer. And that's probably the toughest one and the easiest for things to slip by. If you don't go and actually read the section that's being repealed and compare it to the work that you're doing, that can become an issue.
Well, just so you guys know, they're rarely that clean cut. Usually it's a big old mandatory law with lots of pages, and at the very end, repealing, and they'll just list a couple sections. So for instance, a good example, like when Joe says this happens sometimes and it's really big deals, there was a bill that went through one chamber, didn't go through the second chamber. It was a couple years ago, literally repealed the 5-year manufacturing exemption. Like a huge program in the state of Oklahoma, and everybody missed it. Like everybody missed it. So AJ, you probably remember that. That was some controversy, boy. But that's how they do it, is they stick it in a repealer.
And then here is an example of the resolutions. Lobbyists usually don't deal much with resolutions unless it's something dealing with one of their clients, but these are the ceremonial things that lawmakers like to do for recognizing good things done or encouraging people to do good things or things. And then here's an example of what a ballot title would look like, because I know some organizations do deal with trying to get questions on the ballot. So here's what it looks like when it goes through the legislature by Senator Sinatra and Representative Martin and Davis. And then our wonderful conclusion, yeah, but be sure and go check this out on our website, because I think this will go a long ways to helping understand things. And Jennifer, absolutely, feel free to share that.
We got a good question in the chat about from Whitney about how to keep track of bills still sticking around from last year. It talked about do you combine your tracking list or keep them separate or go more by agendas? Haley, you want to hop in?
Yeah, so what we do is at the beginning of session, we send our clients a list of just the new stuff because it's easy to look at, but you definitely need to also combine them at some point in time. So there's so many bills that unless you're looking at it pretty regularly, what I suggest is just watch as all of the committees put out their agendas is the best way. And if you see something move from last year, then you know it's going to be a little more important. But it's very overwhelming right now. So we've added ours to our tracking list just because, I mean, they are just like any other bill. Right now they're active. But the likelihood of bills from last year moving versus new bills moving, you're going to see a lot more of this year's that were filed move. So just be sure and watch your committee agendas. Those have to come out 24 hours before the committee hearing. Except in the Senate. AJ, does the Senate still have the ability to add bills to an agenda under new business? I know they used to, and I think they maybe still can.
They still can. And then of course, sometimes we still have the committee bill process, but it is not used very often. That's pretty rare.
Yep. So I would just say watch your agendas, but you know, most definitely those can move. So we add them to our tracking list and watch them just the same.
Well, before we wrap up, we're getting close to the end. Does anyone have any questions, any further questions? These were some great questions. I want to thank you two ladies for taking a time away from bill reading.
Happy for the break to see you guys.
I'm surprised Alex can see at this point. Her eyes must be blurry.
Glasses only, no contacts. Yeah, blue light.
Now, I'm sure you've divided this up. Dennis is furiously reading bills too.
Dennis is lucky that he has reached that, you know, that ripe point of his life where we have to slave away over bills. I would say, you know, Alex has probably read the most at this point just because she's having to go through from the legal perspective. I put in a lot of my work. Last week was probably Alex's worst week of her life this session. This week is probably my hardest. So, but Dennis, you know, he's earned his stripes, man. So.
I had the great pleasure of getting to serve with him and loved that. He was a fantastic chairman and a great member of the legislature. And all three of you are wonderful members of Team OICA, and we appreciate you.
Oh, well, thank you. We appreciate you guys. Love working for this issue. Dennis says it best. It's really funny, any of you guys that are served or, you know, kind of know that legislators joke a lot. He always says that there are a lot of things that he's done in his life that keep him up at night, but the work that we do through OICA is the reason he actually sleeps. So.
Well, we certainly appreciate that, and we love working with y'all. And do want to say it's going to be a busy session. If y'all don't use lobbyists as far as the attendees here on the conference, certainly become a member of an association, and they will likely have employees or lobbyists working for them. But if you're working on issues, find that association. Of course, any of the children's issues, be a part of OICA and become a member and attend our bi-weekly chats to talk about the different bills, because we want to be not only the voice for Oklahoma's children, but the voice for you and your youth organizations representing children at the Capitol. So we're a team that hopefully is here for you. Well, we are going to take just a couple of minutes break. If y'all want to stick around, there may be some more questions. I know Paul is on the call now, and so we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. And Paul, if you want to go ahead and get things queued up, we'll give everyone a chance to run to the restroom, refresh the coffee, let the dog out like I need to do, and we'll kick things back off here in about, let's say about 3-4 minutes. All right, I don't want to keep everyone too long. We will go ahead and get things started. Paul, are you here with us?
Hey, Joe, Paul Zierik's here, ready to go, sir.
Excellent. I will just go ahead and turn things over to you, but I first want to introduce you to everybody. For those that don't know you, Paul has two hats that he wears. He is not only the Secretary of the Senate, he is also you're the Secretary of the State Election Board is your official
That's
title?
correct. Yep. Secretary of the State Election Board.
I was about to say chair, but I know you have a board, and that board member is you have a chairman on the board. So we appreciate everything that you do over there. And I want to go ahead and let you kick things off. There have been some changes with the rules and regulations and laws regarding voting. So I wanted to give you some time to talk about how we can make sure Oklahomans know how to vote and get them more engaged.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Joe. It's good to see you. Good to see everyone on the meeting today, the Zoom meeting. If it's okay, I'm going to share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint presentation. If you'll just bear with me a second, and let me start this. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I want to start by saying, Joe, my favorite title of law is Title 26. You were just talking about titles of law. Title 26 is the election code. And if you ever are having trouble sleeping at night, go look up Title 26 on OSCN and make your way through that. That'll help you get to sleep pretty quickly. But actually, it can give you some good insight on how our elections are run and why they are run in certain ways. I thought it would be good to start by kind of giving a broad overview of voting and elections and how do we have the system of elections that we have, and how do we have the voting rights that we have. And so what I'm going to do is take a couple of minutes and go through some provisions of the Oklahoma Constitution and the U.S. Constitution, and just kind of give you some background so you can see where that comes from. So the big one from the Oklahoma Constitution, Article 3, Section 4, explicitly gives the state legislature the sole authority to prescribe the time and manner of holding and conducting all elections, and it gives them authority to enact such laws as may be necessary to detect and punish fraud in such elections. It goes on to give the legislature the authority to provide by law for the registration of electors, which are voters throughout the state. And it also says that no one shall vote unless they have been properly registered according to the law. So if you wonder why the legislature passes election laws, this is why. That's their constitutional duty and authority. Sticking in Article 3 of the Constitution, this describes who is an eligible elector in the state of Oklahoma, and it says, subject to exceptions as the legislature may prescribe, all citizens of the United States over the age of 18 years who are bona fide residents of this state are qualified electors of this state. There are only a few exceptions to this. Of course, this says if you're a citizen, you're a bona fide resident, and you're at least 18 years or older, you are qualified. The exceptions are if a person is convicted of a felony, they lose the franchise as part of their punishment during the period of the full original sentence that's handed down by the court. And then there is also a provision that somebody who is determined by a court of law in this state to be mentally incapacitated also loses the franchise. The state election board, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, but it is a creation of the Oklahoma Constitution, as you can see here. And one of the things that is true among all levels or across all levels of election administration is the bipartisanship of it. And you'll notice that we have a constitutional provision here in Article 3, Section 2 that says not more than a majority of the members of the state election board shall be elected from or selected from the same political party. Article 3, Section 3 gives the legislature the authority to set up a mandatory primary system for the nomination of political party candidates. That's in Article 3, Section 3. That also gives the legislature, actually it requires them to enact laws so that the citizens by petition can place on the ballot independent or nonpartisan presidential electors. As far as election rights go, this is a big one in the Oklahoma Constitution. Article 3, Section 5 guarantees that all elections in Oklahoma shall be free and equal. You can see there that there's a prohibition against civil or military powers from interfering or preventing the free exercise of the right of suffrage. And the Constitution also guarantees that electors, and under our law, that would be registered voters, except for treason, felony, or breach of the peace, are privileged from arrest during their attendance on elections and while going to and from the same. Article 6, Section 5 of the Constitution gives the legislature the final say in determining and officially approving election results, and that occurs here in a joint session during the organizational day that occurs in January following each general election. Now moving to the United States Constitution, there's some similar language as we see in the state constitution. Article 1, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution says the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But then it goes on to give Congress the authority to make some laws or alter those regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. And by the way, I do want to point out that I did not modernize any of the spelling here, so that's not a typo. The way choosing is spelled there, that is actually in the U.S. Constitution. Article 2, Section 1, this deals with how presidential electors are chosen. Nowadays, in every state, they're elected by popular vote, and I think everyone's familiar with the Electoral College. When we go to vote in Oklahoma and vote for president and vice president, we're actually voting for those political parties electors that they have determined will actually vote at the Electoral College for president. But again, that's something under the Constitution that falls to the legislature. There was a time when legislatures would name their own presidential electors, or they would have some other types of methods. But I think everybody in the United States now does that by popular vote. The 14th Amendment, this is a huge one on a number of levels, but in terms of voting, the 14th Amendment, Section 2, guarantees the right to vote to anyone being 21 years of age, a citizen of the United States, unless they participated in a rebellion. The 15th Amendment, this is another huge one. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 17th Amendment is the amendment that changed the way United States senators are elected. I'm sure most of you here know that prior to the 17th Amendment, the legislatures in each state chose their two United States senators, and since the 17th Amendment was adopted, it became a matter of popular vote in each state. The 19th Amendment, very famous. We celebrated the 100th anniversary of that being ratified a couple of years ago. That says that the right to vote in the United States shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The United States Constitution, Amendment number 24 is the one that says that there cannot be a poll tax or other tax required in order to have the right to vote in any election held in the United States. The 26th Amendment lowered the guaranteed voting age from 21 to 18. And so that kind of gives you a broad overview of how we landed where we are today. And both our Oklahoma Constitution and the United States Constitution grants numerous rights to the citizens and to voters. And it also it provides for the way that election laws are enacted, and primarily that's through the state legislature, both through the U.S. Constitution and our state Constitution. Now I want to talk just a little bit about the state election board, just to kind of give you an understanding of what our agency is and what we do. Our mission statement is to achieve and maintain uniformity in the application, operation, and interpretation of the state and federal election laws with a maximum degree of correctness, impartiality, and efficiency. Now that's kind of That's a little wordy, but to boil it down, to translate it or simplify it, that just means we run free and fair elections and we follow the law. And that's the goal of every single election official in the state of Oklahoma. Now, the term state election board can refer both to the appointed board, but also to the agency itself. And the same is true for county election boards. There's a county election board agency, and then there's a 3-member county election board. Now, for the state election board, the secretary that's me, is the chief state election official and also the agency administrator. I'm not a voting member of our board. Our board consists of a chair, a vice chair, and a member. These are appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate, and the governor appoints these people from lists provided by the 2 largest political parties. And while our board is not a governing board, the governing of the agency by law is granted to the secretary. Our board does have some very important duties. They certify election results, they appoint county election officials, they hear contests of candidacy, things like that. So some very important duties for our board, even though they don't govern the day-to-day operations. As Joe mentioned, the Secretary of the State Senate serves as the Secretary of the State Election Board. It's a dual role. They don't really have a lot to do with each other, but it's been that way for well over 100 years. And the Secretary of the Senate is basically the parliamentarian and supervises the record keeping of all the official records of the Senate. And of course, the Secretary of the State Election Board, as I mentioned, is the administrator of the State Election Board agency and the chief election official in the state of Oklahoma. Now, what you're looking at here is the structure for a county election board. And at the county level, the county election board secretary, I have it as CEB secretary here, that is the chief election official in the county. They run the county election board agency. They supervise precinct officials and the employees at the county election board. And unlike the state election board, at the county level, the secretary actually is a voting member along with the chair and the vice chair. And the chair and the vice chair, those are elected positions, but each of the people filling those positions are appointed by their respective parties. And bipartisanship is a critical aspect of election security in our entire system from top to bottom, where there's a guarantee that you have at least one member of the largest political party and one member of the second largest political party, and that helps make for some checks and balances. Next here, when you go vote in person at the polling place, you may not have any idea who these people are, but I'll tell you what their titles are and briefly what their duties are. The judge, that's the person that checks your ID and confirms that you're in the registry and gets you to sign that. The clerk is the one who issues you your ballots, and the inspector is the chief precinct official, and they're in charge of the precinct and have a number of duties to make sure that all the proper functions of that precinct are being done according to law. And just like every other level, state law guarantees that at least one of these 3 top election officials, the judge, clerk, and inspector, at least one is a member of the largest political party in the state, and the other is a member of the second largest political party of the state. The third can be anybody. It could be Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Independent, but you have to have at least one Republican, one Democrat at the precinct at all times, and that's according to law. And that's a good thing because it provides, as I said earlier, a check and balance to make sure that you have kind of eyes from both parties, making sure that the laws of the state are being followed. Now, in the early 1990s, Oklahoma, we implemented our first statewide voting system, very similar to what we use today, but it was an older system. But that's when we started using paper ballots statewide that were hand marked by voters, and they were counted by accurate, reliable, precinct-based optical scan tabulators. In fact, by law, we're required to use optical scan tabulators and paper ballots. In 2012, we installed our current system, so it's going on 10 years old now. Still very accurate, still very reliable, still uses paper ballots and those precinct-based optical scan tabulators. In my opinion, and I think this has been borne out over and over and over again, Oklahoma has one of the most reliable, one of the most accurate, one of the most secure, one of the most efficient and one of the most cost-effective voting systems in the entire world. And we're going to talk about that right now. So first, let's talk about voting and voter registration in Oklahoma. The checks and balances that are in place, the cybersecurity that's in place, the chain of custody that's in place at every level really helps ensure that we have easy voter registration and voting, but also secure voter registration and voting and accurate voter registration and voting. And as policymakers, it's always important for them to try to find a balance between convenience on the one hand and security on the other, because it's possible to make elections so convenient that you have no security and there would be no way to detect if there was any kind of fraud or other type of problem. But likewise, if you go too far on the security, in the security direction, you can make it so hard that it becomes very difficult to vote. But if you'd like to learn more about this, you see our website there, oklahoma.gov/elections. That's a great resource for a lot of information. So how do we vote in Oklahoma? There are three basic ways to do it. The still by far the most popular means of voting is in person on election day at your assigned precinct. But the other two methods have been growing over the years, and I think they'll continue to do so. In-person absentee voting is the legal name for it, but most people call it early voting. That's when you can go usually to your county election board or some other designated location and cast your in-person ballot prior to election day. That's actually today is an early voting day. Believe it or not, I'm looking out there. There is a lot of snow, but our county election boards are all open for early voting today across the state. I think there are 65 of the 77 counties that have elections. There are school board elections and some local elections. I know in Oklahoma City, there's a mayor's race that's going on Tuesday. So early voting is open. That's Thursday and Friday. For state and federal elections, there's also early voting on Saturday, and the legislature has added an early voting day on Wednesdays prior to each general election. So for general elections going forward, there will be an extra day there in November of every even numbered year. And then the last way is just your traditional absentee. Most of that is done by mail, but it also includes nursing homes and some other means of voting absentee. If you're not familiar with it, I would like you to get familiar with the OK Voter Portal. It's a wonderful resource. We call it a one-stop shop for voter services. You can complete a voter registration application there, either download one or use our wizard and then print it off and mail it in or drop it off. You can request an absentee ballot. You can verify your voter registration information, find your polling place, see what districts you're assigned to, view a sample ballot. You can check the status of an absentee ballot if you've voted one. And of course, if you go to our homepage, oklahoma.gov/elections, right at the top there, you can see a link to the OK Voter Portal. But that's a good one for you to use, but also to share with maybe those you work with or those you serve, and point them in that direction to help them find out the information they need and find the services they need in relation to voting. I next want to talk about security, integrity of elections, and also misinformation. And I'm going to leave this slide up here while I talk about this, but you can see if you go to that page on our website, which is oklahoma.gov/elections/security-integrity, we have numerous resources on that page that can help you and anyone you know who's interested to learn more about our voting system and just the large numbers of security measures and integrity measures in place to help protect our elections. Just real quickly, I'm going to run through a few of these things. I don't have by any means time here. I see Joe kind of frowning already. I don't have the means to go through all of these, or we'll be here for the next 3 hours. But first of all, one of the great things about our system, I mentioned earlier, we have a uniform voting system, and it uses paper ballots that are counted by these very accurate precinct-based scanners and similar scanners that count absentee ballots. And because we have that uniformity, it means that Oklahoma is using the same voting devices, the same ballots, and the same standards, the same interpretations of what the law requires for conducting elections at every single precinct in every single county across our entire state. And as far as the accuracy of our elections, we've seen over and over and again, and if any of you have been involved in elections and maybe seen a recount happen, you know this to be true, that time after time after time, recounts prove the accuracy of our system when those are requested. And a couple of recent ones in 2021, almost a year ago, there was a pretty big Edmond City Council race where there was a recount requested, and that recount confirmed the result. Also in August of 2020, there was a pretty big state senator runoff in Southeast Oklahoma. I think it was across 5 different counties and 70 or 80 some different precincts. And that recount came out right on the money in every single precinct. And that's just a testament, I think, to how accurate our system is. We hear a lot in the news about election audits, and actually in 2019, for the first time, our state legislature authorized what are known as post-election tabulation audits. And that's where you kind of do, after an election, you go through and do a spot check. We were preparing to implement those for 2020 when the pandemic hit, and we had to set aside a lot of projects at that point to figure out how to run that election with COVID-19 raging in 2020. But we've ramped that back up, and for 2022, you'll see that after elections, we'll have random spot checks around the state, and that'll all be open to the public, and there'll be public reports posted about that. And it just helps transparency, and I think will improve confidence and enhance confidence in our elections, which I think are already fairly highly thought of by most Oklahomans. As far as system security, we work directly with Oklahoma Cyber Command, which is part of OMES, to help secure our systems. We actually store our election servers, the computer servers, at their server farm, at their secure facility. They also monitor traffic in and out. That they can't see into the system, but they can monitor traffic. And so if there's any kind of malfeasance or any kind of attempt to attack a system like that, assuming someone could even find it, then they have the means in place to help protect that. I mentioned earlier, we have strict chain of custody for everything from our voting devices and ballots and other election equipment. Unauthorized persons aren't allowed to access those. The computer equipment and the voting devices that run the elections are not connected to the internet. That's something that comes up a lot. We get a lot of questions about that, and just to reassure you, that never happens. And then another thing that we do is extensive testing, both at the state level and at the county level, for what is known as logic and accuracy testing. So after a ballot is designed, there's extensive testing done to ensure that if you count for candidate A or vote for candidate A, it's counted for candidate A in the system. I mentioned earlier the bipartisanship that's in effect, and just as you recall, that whether it's my board at the state election board, which certifies election results, or county election boards, or at the precinct on election day, during early voting, the absentee boards that visit nursing homes, there's a bipartisanship at every level there. And again, that's just a check and balance to make sure that both major parties have eyes on the process, and that is critical. It's a built-in bipartisan oversight, and it's required by law. We also have, and I would refer you to the website, but we've got numerous election integrity laws in place that help make sure that the person who's voting is the person that they claim to be, and that the ballots are maintained in a secure manner. But again, if you go to oklahoma.gov/election/security-integrity, you can learn more about that. And the last thing I want to mention, and I promise I'm about to close, being a poll worker is something that it can be very rewarding. Now, and if you want to learn more about this, there's the website. You can go to oklahoma.gov/election/volunteer and learn all about it. But there has been a growing need for poll workers for many, many years. And it varies in Oklahoma from county to county. There are some county election boards that are in desperate need of them, and there are some that have plenty. So it kind of depends on where you live. But it's an excellent opportunity to help promote election integrity by making sure that, for example, if you're one of the political party people who are appointed to work at a precinct, you're the eyes and ears for your party. You can help support your community because by doing that, you're making sure that voters can exercise their right to vote. You can actually earn a little money. We call it volunteering, and it almost is, but you can actually earn $110 a day if you're a judge or a clerk, and I'm sorry, $110 a day as an inspector and $100 a day as a judge or a clerk, and you also get mileage if you're a certain distance away from there. But basically, to be eligible for a precinct official, you have to be registered in the county where you want to work, a registered voter, and you have to demonstrate competence to perform the duties. And again, if you want to learn more about that, just go to oklahoma.gov/elections/volunteer. But we would love to have you if you want to serve. And we just appreciate you giving that consideration. With that, Joe, I'm happy to turn things back over and would be happy to answer any questions that any of the attendees may have.
Oh, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And we do have, let's see, I want to say, I think I saw with the hot button issue of free and equal elections, how does Oklahoma stand in providing this for its citizens? Can these laws for free and equal elections be abridged by the majority of the party in charge at that present time? I can answer that. Most of these are constitutional issues, and so there can be nuances put in there and different specific categories. And well, I'll let you talk about it, Paul.
Yeah, sure.
And you're the you're a messenger. You don't make the decisions on these. You just have to implement what's.
Yeah, I mean, and I should have said this from the top. As an election official, whether it's me or somebody that works at the election board or a county election board secretary or somebody that works at the county election board or even precinct officials, our goal is not to run elections as we wish the laws were written. Our job is to run elections as the laws were written. My policy preferences, Joe, if you were a precinct official, your policy preferences wouldn't matter. We have to follow the law. And the Constitution very clearly gives the legislature the authority to do that. I didn't get much into misinformation earlier, so I'll kind of bring that up here because I think it's a good segue to that. But misinformation can mean a lot of things. And on the one hand, it can be some effort to try to disenfranchise someone by saying, hey, the polls are going to be so busy Tuesday, they're going to let people vote on Wednesday too. Trying to trick people to not go and vote on election day. That's kind of the traditional type of misinformation, and that's a form of voter suppression. But I also think we're starting to see, and this is concerning me, we're starting to see some rhetoric, and it's really true on both sides about calling things that aren't fraud, so false and exaggerated claims of massive voter fraud or election fraud. But also on the other hand, having these, claims that there's this widespread voter suppression going on, and even, trying to claim that something like, say, a voter ID law that's enacted, our voter ID law in Oklahoma was passed democratically by a vote of the people. And while you can have policy disagreements on those kinds of things, I don't think it's good to be using harsh rhetoric and trying to, to compare that to voter suppression, or lately we've even heard some things worse. But but if you hear somebody saying that if we don't pass X, Y, or Z piece of legislation, whether that's in Congress or at the state legislature, if we don't pass this piece of legislation, then our democracy is going to die. That kind of rhetoric is just as bad as someone who's making these wild claims that there's massive widespread election fraud. And from my point of view as an election administrator, if we get to a point where no matter who wins or loses an election, if the losing side is going to truly believe that they only lost because of voter fraud or voter suppression, while both of those can happen, they're both very rare. But if people believe that those things are widespread and that's why their side lost, that's really, really bad for our system of government where we democratically elect our representatives. So I hope that kind of in a roundabout way answered that question.
I think it did. And I'll say one of the funnest things I had the opportunity to do in the legislature, I didn't get to work with you as much as your predecessor was there when I served, but Klingman had me author several of the updates, including the provisional ballot language. And so getting to learn more about that, that was one of the funner parts of state government, learning about those policies, where you can watch the excitement when people register to vote and can be a part of the process. So I'm jealous of some of the work you get to do with folks like that.
Well, and I'll tell you, Mr. Klingman and before him, Lance Ward, Lee Slater, they really, I kind of benefit from the groundwork they helped lay. And really, Joe, you can attest to this because it was true when you were in the legislature. It's still true now. There's really a lot of bipartisan support in the legislature for our election system and the way we conduct elections here, and overall generally a lot of confidence. It doesn't mean you don't have a couple outliers here or there, but for the most part it's true, and it's bipartisan, and I'm very grateful for that. It doesn't mean that occasionally there's not a disagreement between R's and D's in the legislature about a particular election policy, but if you look at the election bills that go through in your average year, there usually aren't a whole lot of them. And the ones that do, the vast majority of them end up passing with bipartisan, large bipartisan majorities. It's very seldom that you see party line votes on election laws in Oklahoma, election bills in Oklahoma. Not that it doesn't happen. It's just probably rarer than we see in other states.
Well, one of my nieces is on this call watching, and she got her voter registration card in the mail last week. So she was really excited about that.
Well, that warms the cackles of my heart to hear about a voter getting registered. That's great.
I wanted to see if there are any other questions. Well, we can close out. Claudia asked, are there any filed bills that you're watching eagerly and advocates should watch without taking a policy stance? Because I know you work for the Senate, you can't do that, but.
Yeah, well, there are dozens and dozens of bills that have been filed, and we're still kind of working our way through to get a grasp of them. Most of those, if I think you talked earlier about how to search for bills that are filed in certain titles of law. I mean, if you want to know what most of those are, go look at the Title 26 amendatory or new law bills that were filed, and you'll kind of see most of those. And there's some that are really good. There's some that maybe I like or don't like. But again, whether I like it or don't like it doesn't matter. The Constitution gives that gives that authority to the legislature, and it's my job as the state election board secretary to follow the law. Now, I will always tell you what I think if you ask me about a particular bill, but I want to be very clear. I don't pass or kill legislation. My job is to follow the law, and so and I see Senator Griffin popping up there. She at one time ran several election and ethics bills too during her time, and I appreciate her service and her help during her years in the state Senate.
We appreciate your service. We're looking forward to an exciting election year. I have no doubt about the workers you have out there, and certainly want to encourage all the advocates on here. Share the word about being a poll worker. Reach out to the county election board. I've wanted to do that. I just haven't set up to do that yet, and so that's something I have a goal to do, is be a poll worker in the future.
It is one of the toughest jobs. It is one of the toughest jobs around, but man, you will love it, because there's nothing like helping your fellow citizens exercise their right to vote. It is wonderful. And real quick, I want to close with this, if it's okay, Joe. It'll take just a few seconds. Back to the misinformation thing. Sometimes there are rumors that float around, especially on election day, that this is happening at that precinct or something else over here. And most of the time, those things turn out not to be true, or somebody saw something and they misunderstood. If you ever see something that you are concerned might be, say, a violation of procedure or the law, if the first thing you do is, tweet about it or call Channel 4, that's not the thing to do. The thing to do is call your county election board, because your county election board secretary, I assure you, wants to make sure that election procedures are being properly followed. And that's the person who can, if there is a problem, can get it fixed. So I'm not saying you can't tweet about it or call Channel 4, but let your election officials know first. Tell your inspector at the precinct. If that doesn't help, call the county election board secretary. If that doesn't help, call my office. And we'll get to the bottom of it. But I just really appreciate you having me on. If anybody ever has questions, Joe, about elections, email me, call me. You know, I'm not hard to get a hold of.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you. Take care.
And we're going to step right into the next conversation. We've got 2 for the price of 1 on this next one. I am really excited about this opportunity because this is one of the new parts that we're adding on to the Legislative Learning Lab. We have not 1, but 2 former speakers of the House that are joining us today to talk about the committee process and basically how that works in the legislature. And I'm not sure which one of you is the senior member or senior person of who I should let go first. So I'll just let you 2 pick. It's my pleasure to introduce to all of you names that I both know you all know, Speaker Jeff Hickman and Speaker Chris Steele.
Thank you so much, Joe. Jeff, or Speaker Hickman, if you would like, I'm happy to defer, or I'm happy to start talking, whatever is most comfortable for you.
Silence means you get to go first.
I'll start talking. Okay, so I think we're going to talk a little bit about the committee process and how that works and what that kind of looks like. And I am super excited to have this discussion with you all today. Joe, first of all, I just want to say thank you for your continued leadership for the state of Oklahoma. My goodness, you are changing the world, and everything that the Institute for Child Advocacy stands for is just phenomenal. And so I thank you, I thank your staff, I thank your board, and I thank everyone who's participating in this call today for your continued efforts to engage in the legislative process. As far as committee goes, I feel like that this is a crowd that really has a really good grasp, but I'm excited to have this conversation because Joe, Jeff, and myself actually got to be a part of sort of at least I want to say revolutionizing, but that's probably too strong. At least bringing the committee process into the 21st century when we were in office, and we did that. And Joel Kinsel was our administrator, and Paul Zurich was a part of that as well. Ultimately, but we were able to like add video to make sure that our committee process is transparent and that committee votes are observed in real time through anybody that has a computer and internet access right now. We also implemented accountability measures that would require recorded votes on conference committee reports so that we could end the practice of members saying they did one thing or doing one thing, and then when they stepped out into the public arena, they said that they did something else, and there was no accountability in that regard. So we were able to do a lot of different things, including recording the committee hearing so that people could go back and replay those. So very quickly, I'll just get started, and then Speaker Hickman can fill in the blanks and talk about correct me where I'm wrong here. But the committee process, you know, if you think about it, the legislative process is virtually 16 weeks. The first 4 weeks, and the legislative process works in cycles. So the first 4 weeks are dedicated to committee work in the House of Origin. So for bills, for House bills that were drafted primarily by House members, they would have to go through the House committee process within the first 4 weeks of session in order for that legislation to stay alive. The same for the Senate. So if it was a senator who drafted the bill, it would have to go through the committee process in the Senate during the first 4 weeks of session in order for that bill to stay alive. So the first 4 weeks, when a bill is drafted, it's reviewed by the floor leader, majority floor leader, and the floor leaders that are assigned or elected in the majority party. So there's a committee of floor leaders who ultimately review the bills and make the committee assignments. Ultimately, the floor leader, the majority floor leader, John Eccles in this case, has the ultimate say-so. But those committees would be assigned, or those bills would be assigned to committee based on subject matter and where they would fit. But ultimately, it is the committee chair that has the discretion to determine whether or not to schedule the bill for a hearing in that committee. And I think it's really important to think of the legislative process sort of as a big funnel. and there's a whole bunch that goes into the top, and just a few things that come out through the funnel part of that, or through the end of that process. And so it's very, very important that we get to know the committee chairs and understand, how to communicate with them. But ultimately, the committee chair will determine whether or not to assign that bill to for a hearing. And assuming the bill passes out of committee, which is, if it's assigned a hearing, probably 9 times out of 10, it will be passed out of committee. But it's also given the opportunity to be amended. So, and I hope I'm correct in this, but committee meetings have a 48-hour notice. So the notice has to be put out 48 hours in advance. And then committee subs, I think, have to be filed by 4:30 the day before the committee hearing. So there's an opportunity to change the bill before it actually gets heard, if there's agreement to do that, and so on and so forth. Committee chairs do have flexibility to waive some of those timelines and those requirements. But after the committee or the bill is assigned to a committee and it's heard in committee, it passes out of committee, it would go through a hearing on the floor of the House of Origin, and then, assuming it passes over there, it would be transferred, engrossed, and transferred over to the opposite chamber, and it would go through that same committee process in the opposite chamber. So the first 4 weeks of session are committee hearings and some floor activity. Weeks 5 and 6 are primarily floor activity. Then the process starts over again in the opposite chamber for the bills that have made it through that process to date. It's another 4-week cycle of committee meetings, another 2 weeks of floor activity. And then if the bill is amended, let's say it goes through the committee process in both chambers, but is amended by the opposite chamber on the floor, or at any process in the committee process, it goes back to the House of Origin, and the primary author has the opportunity to either accept Senate amendments and schedule the bill for a hearing, or reject Senate amendments and request a conference committee. And the conference committee process is comprised of members from both the House and the Senate. And that's a process that usually takes place in that last 4 weeks in May, where the members would get together and really try to hammer out a compromise and have agreement. At the end of the day, this whole process, and I'll stop here, but the whole process is intended to shed light and transparency, to make sure that ideas are fully vetted. And at the end of the day, our Constitution requires that any legislation that's passed on to the executive branch has to receive approval in identical form from both chambers. There's some nuances that also surround the appropriations process and the appropriations committee, and we can get into that a little bit later if we need to, but I'll just stop there and say it's really, really important that you get to know the floor leader and the team of people who are making the assignments to the committees based on, the subject matter of the legislation, because there's some discrepancy that can take place there. Really important that you get to know the committee chairs, and it's really important that you stay engaged and follow the bills through the committee process. Speaker Hickman.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Agent.
Hello, Representative Dorman. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you both for joining us today. We appreciate your joining in and offering your expertise on this cold, snowy day.
Well, happy to do it. I apologize, I got in a little bit late, so I don't want to plow the same ground Speaker Steele did. And if there's specific questions you want to talk about, I know you're talking about the committee process. And I would just add one thing to what Speaker Steele said, which is you hope the committee process is the process that makes bills better. A lot of times an author will file a bill and will not have thought through all of the consequences or unintended consequences, and sometimes those come up in questions in committee, and amendments can be made, and so ideally this process of where it's not easy to pass a bill, it's by design, and hopefully those bills improve as they go through the committee process, through the floor process, and then start over in the committee on the other side. So it definitely, these are all open meetings too. I'll add, as the Speaker Steele mentioned, the agendas are posted, amendments are posted in advance. you can attend a meeting in person. And I don't know if, I think they're all broadcast online now too. I don't know if they have video of both, but I know there's audio for sure. You can listen in that way. But the most important thing is to make sure that you are in conversation with the members of that committee, the author of the bill, and as Speaker Steele said, the leadership if there's an issue you care deeply about.
I've got one question I want to throw out to both of you, because both of you have been in this role working with your floor leaders, but a lot of people assume that the committee chair is going to be the foremost expert on the subject matter, and you would hope that they will be, at least by the time they begin that role. But what goes into the process of selecting committee chairs and the leadership team on each committee? And then also, how do the members themselves end up on a committee? And Jeff, you go
Speaker
first.
Steele, you want that? You want me to take it? I'll start, and then Speaker Steele can jump in. And each speaker probably has a different process or way they go about selecting committees and chairs. When I was speaker, I asked the members to let me know what their areas of interest were. It didn't mean that's where I was going to put them by any means, but I asked for their kind of their requested assignments or what their areas of interest are. But I also, and I was maybe more involved in that process than some, because I just felt like that was very important to make sure we had the right people on the right committees, that we matched their expertise and their areas of need. And so it was important for me to be involved. Some speakers leave that up to other people on their leadership team or their staff. And I worked closely, and I think Speaker Steele did when he was speaker as well, with his leadership team and his staff to determine committee chairs and committee structure. But for me, it was to match up areas of expertise with committees, people that knew those issues, that would be engaged in those issues, that were there for the right reasons, quite frankly, that were going to read the bills, that were going to take the role seriously, and really cared about those issues. And so we were very intentional about assigning members and particularly committee chairs to those places. So I did seek some input, but ultimately the speaker makes those appointments, and that's how that process worked during my time when I was speaker. Speaker Steele, you want to add to that?
Sure. Just one other caveat. I think Speaker Hickman and I followed a similar process. We always started out with questionnaires. We gave each a member of the legislature a questionnaire and invited them to identify their areas of interest or expertise, and then we followed that up with some very intensive conversations. But in addition to matching members with their areas of interest and sort of what they would want, we would also look at the district that they represented, and if there were areas of interest within the district that would be significant to a committee assignment, we would also take those factors into consideration. And then just one other thing that I think is a very positive development in recent years is that the practice now is to allow the minority leader to make the assignments for the minority party. That was not always the case in Oklahoma. Historically, has always been the speaker that would make the assignment for all the members. But in recent years, the practice has been to allow the minority leader to make the appointments for the minority party. I think that's really, really important, because at the end of the day, we want fair representation and equal involvement to the extent possible.
And Joe, I would just add, and Speaker Steele can chime in as well. It's just like every legislator. Every legislator is different. They're there for different reasons. At the end of the day, you hope they are there for Oklahoma. But sometimes people are there for other reasons, and you always hope the number of people that are there for Oklahoma outnumber the people that are there for other reasons. And it's that way in the speaker's office. You're going to have speakers that are more interested in the political side of things, and you're going to have some that are more interested in the policy side of things, and that will be reflected in how they make these assignments, or whether they make these assignments or they hand them off to other members of their leadership team or their staff to do. And Speaker Steele and I definitely were probably much more policy oriented than some, and may have been more involved directly in making sure we had committees that would work and function for both the majority and minority parties, so that the legislative process works better at the end of the day.
Good deal. And Ann Roberts asked probably the most important question: how can advocates get involved with the committee process?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start, and then Speaker Hickman can add to this response. A great question. Um, First of all, understand that the process itself belongs to the people of the state of Oklahoma, and so the meetings are open to the public. And where we're not in a pandemic and it's safe to do so, you can physically participate in the committee process. You can sit in, listen, request to speak, and if the author of the bill or if the chair agrees to do that, sometimes they allow, sometimes they don't, depending on schedules and time constraints and things of that nature. You can also ask to be on the committee notification distribution list, and they will send you an email. You can go to the chair and ask that you be placed on the committee notification email list, and they will send you a notification of when the committee is going to meet. And you can either log in, and as Speaker Hickman said, you can participate virtually, or you can show up in person. But I think it's very, very important. The committee process at the end of the day may be the most, I mean, obviously if a bill doesn't make it out of committee or is not assigned to committee, it doesn't go anywhere. And for the most part, I think the significant work takes place in the committee process. So if you can get engaged in the committee process, stay involved, make sure that the language is good and right coming out of committee, you stand a much better chance of building support, because most legislators will say, hey, if the committee recommended this, they took a closer look at it, then it must be okay.
We'll open this up for any of the advocates that have questions. I'm responding to one about where to go to find the sites, and there we go. For some reason, it's capitalizing Oklahoma Senate. Us House guys, I know we don't like that, but.
Well, and if you go, usually I think there's an audio video link. Actually, let me just jump over there and look. There is actually on the House page, it's called Media. And then when you scroll over that, then it gives you some options, and one of them is House Audio Video, and you can scroll down. And in fact, there is a test going on as we speak of the House video from 9 to 10. It says in progress. So apparently they're still testing their feed, and then the sessions on Monday are already there. The links are already there, so you can get to all of that there. One thing I might add, Joe, if there's time, and it happens every year, and it has happened again. I've been hearing from people, and I've been out of the legislature for 5 years now, but it happened again the last couple of weeks. Bills are filed, and any member of the House can file any bill they want on any subject they want, no matter how great it is for the state or how crazy it may be or detrimental it could be in someone's opinion to the state. And there's no limit to the number of bills a legislator can request. Now, there's a limit in the House, or at least we had a limit, unless they've changed that. You can only have 8 bills heard. So you can file 100. 92 of them will not be heard, but you can move 8 of them through. The Senate doesn't have similar limits. But so all of these bills have been filed. Many of those bills have been filed for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to write a press release and to put out that legislator filed that bill. And that's what you're seeing. You're seeing some and the media loves those types of bills too, because it gives them great fodder to write about leading into session about all of the things, somewhat silly, that are going on at the Capitol. And so people get all worked up. People that aren't real familiar with the process get all worked up, and they're concerned. And what about this bill? What about that bill? Most of the energy people are putting into this process right now is on bills that will never be heard or will never make it out of the committee, because most of these bills won't go anywhere. And so that would just be one thing. You need to monitor all of those things. But until a bill pops up on a committee agenda, I wouldn't get overly concerned. You need to have your government affairs team. You need to be watching all of these things. But there's no reason to get alarmed until that bill pops up on a committee agenda. And at that point, you need to be having conversations with members of the committee and the author. And it doesn't hurt to have conversations, to reach out and express your concern about bills early on. I'm not saying don't do that at all. I'm just saying don't go jump off the top of the Channel 4 television tower when you see some of these bills and think that the sky is falling, because most of them aren't going anywhere. But nonetheless, be vigilant, be watchful. But a lot of these bills will never make it even on an agenda for a committee meeting. They sure won't make it out of the committee or out of the House of Origin, and most likely will never get to the governor's desk. So just be calm, but definitely be paying attention to what's going on. The other thing is, and you guys have probably noticed it, Speaker Steele and Representative Dorman, there are maybe more shell bills now. And I know we did a lot of work to get rid of shell bills. Speaker Steele and I both were involved in reforming the appropriations and budget process to get rid of shell bills. Those are coming back, and that's something the legislature is going to have to deal with, because there are a lot of shell bills there. And what a shell bill is it's just a vehicle to put language in later, so you don't have to put it out there in advance too early, or worry about someone attacking it. Or sometimes it's good because you have an idea that needs to be developed, but there are a great deal of shell bills this year, and I think it's something that even some of the legislature are concerned about, that they're going to have to deal with. We reformed. It used to be the budget process was that way. You had to pass all these shell bills and then put numbers in them later. We reformed that and have changed that system, but we're seeing more and more shell bills pop up in other ways, and that's something the legislature is probably going to have to deal with.
I was so glad both of you could be on here, as you two probably initiated most of the changes on the committee process. So one of the newer ones is the JCAB, the Joint Committee on Appropriations and Budget, which allows for late filing of bills. And so that, in a way, has also replaced some of the things that happened with shell bills, just filing a bill and then throwing language in later. Now you can have bills filed within the last week or two. And so it's very important for the advocates to watch the committee process, because of the 5,000 bills out there, the only time they're all considered live rounds is when they're in committee, and probably only about 40% will make it out. And so just be diligent, but also make sure that you like you said, don't lose your cool about some of these things, because they're press release bills, and a lot of them, the committee chairs will do their job and filter those out and not allow a lot of those to work their way through the system.
Unless the bill's authored by the Speaker or the Pro Tem of the Senate. That's the other thing to watch for. So if it's a bill you're worried about and it has one of those names on it, then you might want to go ahead and be concerned.
Oh, can I just give one final thought as we move away from this, and +1 underscore everything Speaker Hickman just said. That's such a good reminder. But I would also just want to say to this group, to the Institute for Child Advocacy, it's also important to note that everybody, not just legislators, but legislators too, I think everybody at the end of the day wants to be a part of something meaningful, wants to be a part. You wouldn't run for office if you weren't at least interested in improving quality of life, safety for kiddos, opportunities for children in the state of Oklahoma, safety for children in the state of Oklahoma. You guys have a meaningful agenda, a significant agenda. Share your agenda with legislators. Make sure that they know about it. They're going to want to be a part of it, because at the end of the day, what you're advocating for is going to lead to lasting changes that make a significant improvement in the state of Oklahoma. So be bold, be courageous, and be intentional about sharing your agenda and why you're fighting for what you're fighting for.
We appreciate both you gentlemen, not only for your service in the legislature, but Chris, for your work with restorative justice, and Jeff, for your work for making sure that Oklahomans are getting the best quality education, higher education that they can possibly get. So we appreciate both of you for your continued service.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And we are moving into our final discussion, which I am excited about. This was something we weren't able to include last year also. A deep dive conversation into the executive branch. And we're very fortunate to have a gentleman who just finished up his stint with the cabinet and with serving as the chief operations officer of the state. And you can correct me if I had that wrong, John, but someone who also I've gotten to know through the Oklahoma Academy and through just his work in the community. He and his wife are both tremendous public servants, and we're glad that and thankful that you took a break from the corporate world to work for the state. And I'm glad you are still sticking around and doing work. So it's my pleasure to introduce John Budd.
Thanks, Joe. Happy to be here, and let me know if my audio is okay. I will warn you that, like a lot of the rest of you, I have a 14-year-old co-worker here who's playing video games, and I've cautioned him not to yell, but any of you that have teenagers, that doesn't last for very long. So I do know a number of the people on the call. I don't know everybody, but so let me give you a little bit of my background. Like a lot of people in the SID administration, I had a deep corporate background. I worked for General Electric. I was a management consultant for Boston Consulting Group for many years. I worked for Sonic here in Oklahoma City. And when that company was acquired, I actually intended to take significant time off, but then got the call in December of 2018 to serve with Governor Stitt, whom I did not know previous to that, but it was an amazing opportunity to come at the start of the administration and try to redefine the executive branch and what it does and how it relates to the rest of government. So that's that background. I did serve with Governor Stitt and the administration for 2.5 years. So year one was very much just trying to redefine government and what it does and try to improve services. Year two, the pandemic hit, obviously, and that shifted the focus pretty dramatically to standing up testing and vaccination strategy and a bunch of other things relating to the pandemic. I left in July of this past year, and then have taken time off for about 6 months, and I recently joined the George Kaiser Family Foundation to work with them. So I've kind of continued now in more of the public service sphere versus the corporate sphere. That's my background. I do want to go through some slides, but I also would encourage folks to ask questions. Anybody who knows me, and there's several folks that do, knows I'm less of a talker than most, and I'm pretty good on Q&A. So if I miss something, or if you want me to go deeper onto something, please don't hesitate to ask me. Now, Joe, do I have the ability to share my screen? Okay, let's see if I can do that.
If not, we will make sure you have it. There we go.
Okay, you see, okay, let's see if I can blow this up now. You all seeing the slides? Are you seeing also the little, I tried to get full screen, it may not work. Is there full screen now, guys?
Got it.
Okay, so this is my perspective on the executive branch. It's not endorsed by anybody, so it's kind of my take on things. I do think that Governor Stitt has tried to run things a little differently from previous administrations, and hopefully that will come out. I think some of this maybe you all may be aware of, but if not, hopefully I'll round out your understanding. So really, this is 101 level stuff, but just like the federal level, there's 3 branches of government. There's the executive, legislative, and judicial. Most of what I think you all would be focused on would be the executive and legislative branches, with the judicial branch kind of calling balls and strikes at the end of any processes. I'm going to talk about the executive branch. As you know, just either being part of the process or following in the media, there have been conflicts between the executive and legislative branches over the last couple of years. I think Governor Stitt's tried harder and harder to work collaboratively. And probably last year was a more successful year in the legislative session for the executive branch than the previous year. But it's important to note, just all respect needs to go to the legislative branch. All the laws that you're advocating for, the budget, that all starts with the legislative branch. There's obviously negotiation between the branches. The governor has the right to veto. The legislature has the right to override a veto. But it's important to note that the executive branch does not and cannot exist in isolation. It's all part of one big system. Again, some of this will be review, but it's important to note that how the governor has run the executive branch starts with his vision, which everybody in Oklahoma, probably 4 million Oklahomans know this top 10 state mantra, but he really came in to try to make Oklahoma a top 10 state. Now, that sometimes gets played back to him in a way that's critical. So yeah, we're not going to be in the top 10 in a good way on incarceration. It's not going to happen. Not in this 4-year period, but someday it might. But the mission was always to make progress towards those things, recognizing that if we're 50th in incarceration or 48th in education or whatever, health outcomes, these things don't change overnight. You have to change investment in systems and processes to try to move those things in the positive direction. Now I'll show you a scorecard at the end of my slides that starts to track progress in these areas, but this really is how the governor thinks about things, what he says publicly and what he does around top 10 state, that mantra, those things are very much connected. This is a slide that's used within the executive branch. This is something we worked on early in 2019 as the governor came in to try to align on values as an executive branch, as a team, as a cabinet, and then try to drive this down into the agencies. It really does start with being a top 10 state, moving towards being a top 10 state. The first aspect of that is the purpose, which is to change Oklahomans' futures for the better. And that really is the rallying cry. As the governor's brought people onto the team, he does look for people who share these core values, desire to make a difference, a get it done attitude, being coachable and humble, being street smart and being a team player. I think you've seen folks that come in and really are trying to make an impact. You may disagree with some of the things that they're doing, but the governor brought people in to make change and not necessarily adhere to the status quo. Obviously, execution matters, and some things don't get executed well, but by and large, this is the sort of mindset that he's hired for. And ultimately, it's about being customer-centered, growth-oriented, next-generation focused. There are folks who don't like this customer orientation language. People of citizens of Oklahoma are not customers. They are the bosses of the legislature. They have and the governor. That is absolutely true. I think the notion is more around less a business notion of customers and more of a guest notion. These are people that we serve through our agencies. How do we make sure they're getting proper service? That we're taking care of them the way you would a guest in your home or a customer in your place of business. So that's really the notion there. Let me talk a little bit about the organization structure. We'll go a little deeper here in a second. But the way the executive branch is set up, the governor has 3 direct reports. First, he has the chief of staff, that's Bond Payne. Bond runs the governor's office. He schedules the governor. He manages the public interactions. That's really his role. It's a very, very traditional chief of staff role. Secretary of State Brian Bingman runs the governor's legislative agenda. He's a former pro tem in the Senate, so he's got deep legislative experience. And then COO Steve Hart manages the cabinet, which is where all the agencies are. There are 470 agencies, boards, and commissions in the state, which creates a ton of complexity, I think, for external advocates to sort through. You all probably know the ones that really matter in terms of budget and policy, but there's a whole lot of folks that are part of the executive branch. As I think about the role of advocates, clearly, if you want a legislative advocate within the executive branch, it's going to roll up into Secretary Bingman. But if you're going to be working with the agencies, Steve Harp is going to be your, ultimately, those folks will report to Steve. So these people do work together, but at the same time, they do have some distinct roles. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit off slide about how this works in practice. You may have seen an article by Ben Felder today about how, well, at least in his point of view, the budget process is not transparent. When you're looking at, let's talk specifically about the budget process. There are budget hearings. You're seeing those now in front of the various committees. At the same time, what's happening in the executive branch is the state COO Steve Harp and state CFO Amanda Rodriguez are listening to a similar sort of pitch that the legislature gets around the budget. Here's the funding that we need for our agency for the next year. Here is what we're going to use it for. Now, we don't have zero-based budgeting in Oklahoma. It's basically a yes and approach where, hey, here's how much we got last year. Here's how much more we need this year. In a time where we have a fairly substantial surplus, you're unlikely, I think, to get agency budgets docked unless there's some specific reason to do so. So if we were in a tougher time, you might go back to more of a zero-based approach, but essentially agencies are coming in and pitching how much more they need for their budget. It's a parallel process between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So CFO Amanda Rodriguez and COO Steve Harp, they're listening to all these agency pitches. It's very much a similar format to what goes in front of the legislature. And then what's happening on a weekly basis is Secretary Bingman, CFO Rodriguez, and the approach chairs and their vice chairs are meeting or will be meeting to talk through budgetary priorities. So essentially, if you are advocating for a particular investment, your likeliest path is to get the legislature on board because they ultimately are the ones who put the budget on paper and send it to the governor. But the executive branch also can advocate for you. So they are meeting on gubernatorial priorities and legislative priorities, and there's some negotiation that goes on a weekly basis until the budget's ultimately produced at the end of the session. Similar with legislation, obviously the legislature drives that agenda. Secretary Bingman, though, does have a set of policy folks that work for him on various areas, and he will work with the governor to set legislative priorities. And ultimately, similar to lobbyists, Secretary Bingman and his team will be working with legislators to try to get bills introduced and through the process. So both these processes, legislation and budget, go through the legislature, and the legislature has the most control of the process until that very end, that veto moment. But there's a strong spirit, I think, of collaboration between the leadership in the legislature and the governor's leadership to try to get to a process that everybody, or a process and content that everybody can work with. So that's my view on how this works. Again, I'm happy to answer questions and go into greater detail as needed. I do think it's useful to, because this isn't transparent necessarily to the outside world, to talk about how the executive branch is actually set up from an operations standpoint. The governor is the governor. The COO is Steve Harp. That was the role that I had until July of last year. And then there's a cabinet that's arrayed across this page here. So things like health and mental health, that's Kevin Corbett, who also runs OICA, Human Services, Justin Brown, also who runs DHS, et cetera, across the page. These cabinet secretaries, there are some that have grown up within state government, people like Blaine Arthur in agriculture, Tim Gatz in transportation, and then there are many that came in from outside of state government. I will say, as somebody who is, it's fair to say I'm substantially more politically moderate than the governor. We did bring in people who have experience and passion in the areas that they're working in, and I think are trying to drive change. I don't think there's anybody that we brought in the cabinet role that was there to collect a paycheck or to put another notch on the resume. The cabinet secretaries who are agency directors make an agency director's salary. The cabinet secretaries who are not agency directors either get about 25 grand a year, or in some cases they have declined the compensation entirely. So these are not people making it rich off the government dime. At most, they're making the agency director salary, and in many cases, they're not even getting that. So they're there to to serve the public, to serve a mission, and not in any way, I don't think, to enrich themselves. While some of the cabinet secretaries have outside jobs, I think over the last 3 years, there's been very little in terms of conflict of interest, almost perhaps nothing in the area of conflict of interest, which I think was a concern coming in. So yes, some of these people are also do have a job outside of state government, but I think by and large, they've kept their heads down to try to achieve the mission within state government. Now, you see the agencies at the bottom of the page. There are 470 agencies, boards, and commissions in the state of Oklahoma. That's a lot. That's more per capita probably than any other state in the union. I will also say we launched a project in 2019 to try to assess the organization. And it took us a few weeks just to figure out how many agencies we had. We started with a list of over 600 and then realized that some of those had been sunsetted. Some of those were duplicates, like the same agency had two different names on various lists and so forth. So just to figure out how many agencies, boards, commissions the state has took us a few weeks. There's a whole lot of potential reform and cleanup there. Now, the way we thought about executive branch operations was that the agencies report to the cabinet secretary. The cabinet secretaries are sort of like the chairman for a particular area or chairwoman for that particular area. It works that way for the most part. The reality, though, is that legislation establishes these agencies. So some of them have a governance structure that involves an outside board. Some of them have a separately selected or elected official. For example, education and labor, those are separately selected or elected positions. So while the intent is to kind of run this as one big organization, the reality is that there are varying degrees of independence within the agencies. Some of them are right in line with the governor's agenda, and some there's some clashes between the agencies and the governor, which is fine, and it's worked through for the most part. You're all aware just from reading in the media some of the things that are a little more challenging. The reality of legislation is that there are very few powers that are specifically placed into cabinet secretaries. They're basically set up as advisors legislatively. We did, though, use the cabinet secretaries as coaches for agency directors, as conveners of the cabinet, as goal establishers, and that we were, and the governor continues to try to run this like one big organization pulling in the same direction. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The governor has talked about bringing business principles to state government. I think he'll get criticism for that sometimes. Government's not a business. He knows that. Everybody knows that. It's really more about how do you make sure that your agency directors have clear lines of authority. They know who they work for and what they're there to do. How do you make sure you have agencies working on goals that are anchored in their missions? When we got to the state in 2019, there were many agencies that had goals that measured inputs, number of hours worked on something, or number of X produced or whatever, versus lives changed or things that are more closer to what they're trying to accomplish. Trying to better measure progress, looking at processes to try to improve the speed of them, trying to improve budgeting, which is still very much last year plus X, but I think there's more in place now around agency CFOs reporting out to the state CFO, and there's better alignment, at least on ongoing financial management of the agencies. Improving digital access for services, and then ultimately looking at improving customer service. So several things there that, and I think as you look at this list, it's very hard to argue with these as being good things for the state of Oklahoma. It's not about necessarily just driving savings, just driving efficiency. A lot of it's around trying to drive better performance. The expectation of cabinet secretaries, these are folks there to do, not just talk. They're supposed to go out and meet with their agencies and try to drive improved performance. They're trying to reduce bureaucracy. They're trying to link to the agency. It's not a ceremonial role. It's not an advisor role. It's very much a management role, and that's the expectation. I think that's how it actually works. Agency leaders, they are charged with making sure they have a mission that really benefits Oklahomans. They understand how money is being spent to support that. They're responsible for outcomes, and they're responsible for being part of the team. So that was really the expectation. I do think, and there are multiple ways to do this. I think there's an argument to be made that agencies reporting to outside boards and not part of the broader agenda, that can work. It works in a lot of states. We had a core belief, though, that we could try to drive in the same direction, and that would be more beneficial for Oklahoma. So there is an expectation that the agency leadership will coordinate and collaborate with the rest of state government. I think this is my last slide before I kick it over to any questions. The governor and therefore executive branch is very interested in performance and driving to being a top 10 state. This is a screenshot of the governor's dashboard. You can find it at gov-dashboard.ok.gov. We launched it 2 years ago, really, right around the time the pandemic hit Oklahoma. And so we never really promoted that much, but I can tell you that the cabinet looks at this every cabinet meeting, and there are questions about areas where we're not seeing improvement. I'll orient you to this a little bit. Unfortunately, you can't measure everything you'd like to. So this is a mixture of things we wanted to measure and then things we could measure. But essentially, you have, in most of the areas that matter in government, what is a metric we can measure the state on? What is the current value? And these, you can see from the dates on here that this is a bit dated. What's the value of that metric right now? How has it changed in the last quarter, in the last year? What is Oklahoma's rank in that metric? What would it take to be a top 10 state? And then also, what's the US average? So you can see, as noted, Oklahoma is not top 10 in a lot of these metrics. We are in a few, and I think there's improvement in there. But what we were looking for is really green in these two columns on quarter over quarter and year over year change. Are we improving in savings, in unemployment rate, in children in custody, in roads and bridges? And this is something that the cabinet and the governor look at. Actually, the governor looks at this pretty much every week, and the cabinet looks at it at every cabinet meeting. So this notion of a through line between being a top 10 state all the way through to driving performance, that's the intent of the governor and the team. And I think to the extent you're advocating to that team, if you can speak the language of top 10, if you can speak the language of, if we do this, it will reduce kids in custody and get us to improve that performance, or it'll reduce energy costs for Oklahomans, or it'll improve health outcomes. I think to the extent that you can anchor what you do in that language to drive overall performance, I think you get more support from the governor's team. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to answer questions or go down any path that I might have missed. And so I see Ann's question there. Yeah, I think the Department of Libraries still does do that book. We tried to work to bring it more online, but I think that book is still produced every year by the Department of Libraries. It's a valuable resource, but I think we could all acknowledge that if we were able to kind of click through the state government websites to figure that all out, it might be a little better.
John, how often do the cabinet secretaries meet in cabinet meetings?
Yeah, during session, and that may change this year. I'm not involved anymore, but during session, we had the cabinet meet twice a month, and then out of session, we had the cabinet meet about once a month, maybe every 3 weeks. And some of those meetings were off-site, or we would go around the state. So we went to McAllister and visited the state prison together, and tried to do some of those things to make sure we're getting out into the state during the off session.
Good deal. Allie, do you have a question?
First off, it's really good seeing you again, Joe, Regent Hickman. And it stinks that Chris had to get off because he really taught me a lot when he was speaker about how to not just live with a severe TBI, but how to be a leader and how to help others. So I'm really grateful that he was able to do that for me and everything. But to let you guys know what I'm doing now here in Stillwater is building a nonprofit for traumatic brain injury survivors. And I'm going on my 12th year substituting at, well, I'm at 6th year at the junior high, and I will sometimes substitute the 9th grade, like Senator Talley's son, for the social studies class. And one of the things I love doing for the kids is teaching them about the government. And the thing prior to the COVID, I would teach them what OIL does about how to write legislation and everything. And some of the legislation the kids came up with was hilarious about, hey, let's shorten the school year. Let's lengthen the summer. Let's do this and this. I was like, no, let's not really do that. But could you guys give me some better examples about maybe what I could possibly do for when I go substitute, like the social study and government classes? That would be really good about showing the kids how government works and maybe showing them how legislation and stuff. And I've even told Saul and the other government teachers that I know how to write legislation and that stuff. And if they want me to go in and teach the kids or just be a speaker or something like that, and they don't even have to leave, just let me come in and do that.
Absolutely. I can definitely help you with that, and I can get you some of those documents sent up. And I will do that. And I know there is a question also from Terry. When advocating, would you recommend addressing how the proposed change would support the goal of one of the topics listed on the dashboard? That's great. How can advocates directly impact on those?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm gonna say yes, definitely. But I'd also say there's an executive budget book that's put out every year. It's quite extensive. It's something that Secretary Mazie really kind of blew up into a big thing a few years ago, and it's been continued. In that executive budget book, there is what the governor's looking for, but then every single agency, every major agency has its list of goals. And I think if you were to go not just to that dashboard, but also if you're talking to a specific agency, if you anchored yourself in the 5 goals that the agency is shooting for and couched your advocacy in terms of how you could help that agency achieve those goals, I think that would be a really solid strategy.
Good deal. And I added some extra for your question, Allie, there, and I'll work with you on that. There are other questions for, should I still call you Secretary Bud? You're always referred to by the title.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
John's almost a neighbor too. We still haven't had a chance to get together because he's been too busy. Are any other questions? This has been fascinating because that's one of the things oftentimes you hear about the cabinet, but you don't understand how the cabinet works, how they're appointed, how they're selected, what roles they have with the agencies. And so that's something I certainly wanted us to cover. And I greatly appreciate that with what you did with this. And if it's all right, well, I want to get your PowerPoint and I want to put it on with all the other documents too, so people can see that.
Sounds good. Okay. Well, I'm happy to help.
Are there any other questions? If they're not, we'll get into the wrap up. We ran a few minutes over, but that was certainly worth it. That was some fantastic content. I learned a lot, and I appreciate that. I knew about the dashboard, but that was something I hadn't looked at in a while. So I'm going to continue to watch on that because there are some of the key points there that we're certainly interested in with OICA.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, I hope everyone has enjoyed their second day. For those of us, numbers were down a little bit because I know some people were locked out of the office and had to watch from home today, but hopefully things will pick back up tomorrow. And I know Monday is going to be a very exciting day. We've got some fantastic speakers lined up for each day. We're halfway through. If you have any questions or any comments, certainly drop them to me in email. Christine is emailing you the links daily. We will get those out for tomorrow sent pretty quickly. And just appreciate everyone for being a part of this, and send us some comments, feedback if we're missing something. We certainly want to know in preparation for the Learning Lab for next year. And with that, everyone go grab some lunch and we'll see you tomorrow.